You've got your story straight. You've spent months prepping to go undercover and infiltrate the Italian-American Mafia. You are no longer named Joseph Pistone, and from now on, you'll only answer to a name the crew calls you. You've got a fake driver's license that bears that name, and you've got swagger befitting a gangster. You know how to use that Mafia twang and say, "How you doing?" and forget about it in just the right way. You're going to try and fool some of the most dangerous criminals in the world and bring them down. That will mean seeing some disturbing things, and as you move through this new life, every day could be your last. This is the story of one of the biggest lies the FBI ever told. The story of a man who was once known as Donnie Brasco. Joseph Joe Pistone was the right fit for an undercover cop who would infiltrate an Italian-American crime family. He was part Sicilian, grew up in New Jersey where the Mafia presence was strong, and so he had the background and knew the patois of those gangsters. He looked the part, sounded the part, and when the time came, he was ready to be a wise guy. In fact, a much wiser guy than the wise guys he worked with. His early life didn't consist of petty crime and fighting in the mean streets of New Jersey. He studied hard, attained a degree in anthropology, and later went to work for naval intelligence. It wasn't until 1969, when he was 30 years old, that he started working for the FBI. 5 years later, he was moving to New York when he joined the truck hijacking unit, with hijacking trucks being a big money spinner for the Mafia. Sometimes the truck drivers were in on it too, and took payment and maybe a black eye for a payoff. Hundreds of trucks were getting done over and millions of dollars of items were being stolen. It didn't really matter what the bounty was, it could all be sold on. In 1974, when Pistone joined that unit, the truck hijacking business was bringing in $4.2 million a year. Something had to be done. But it wasn't the truck hijacking that made Pistone a well-regarded name in the FBI. It was when he went undercover for the first time and brought down a vehicle theft ring. 30 people were arrested and the FBI knew they had a man they could use. It was 1976 when Pistone put his hand up and said he was willing to go undercover again, but this time the assignment was about as dangerous as could be. He said he'd infiltrate one of the 5 families that ran New York City's criminal underworld. That was the Bonanno crime family. He spoke Italian fluently, including the street slang of the gangsters. He'd grown up among them and had a Sicilian heritage, and as he proved, he could work well undercover. There wasn't really a better man for the job. He just needed to create a backstory, and that meant everything. From fictional fights he had in high school, and how much he loved his grandmother's pasta con lassarde and mouth-watering cassata siciliana, he had to know names in the Mafia and how the organization worked. He had made up past loves, he had been kicked around the tough streets, and that's how he got into crime. His principal income was jewel thievery, and if you're a jewel thief, you have to know a thing or two about jewels. This was a tricky part of the backstory, and Pistone had to spend some time studying gemology. He passed with bright flying colors. His name was erased. He was expunged from history. There was no Joe Pistone now, only Donnie Brasco, the jewel thief. It was intended that he'd stay this way for 6 months, but as you'll see, things didn't quite work out that way. One day, this man named Donnie turned up in Little Italy. He frequented restaurants and hung out in bars. He always seemed to have a lot of cash on him. And while he didn't immediately tell the folks he met why this was, he did get particularly friendly with a barman at one place. Then, he let it be known that he had jewels and he knew where he could get more jewels. He was useful to any criminal empire. With all the cash he had, he was obviously pretty good at his job. You have to think about how dangerous this was. It wasn't as if he was working in Alaska. He could have easily been spotted by someone he knew, and if met on the street and called Joe, he was done for. To prevent anyone from letting the story out, only a few people in the FBI knew about the operation, while his co-workers just thought he'd moved on someplace. His own friends didn't know where he'd gone. The man was a ghost. He couldn't be seen to be big time, otherwise someone would have already heard of him. But the act was that while he was small time, he could certainly get involved with bigger things and likely earn for a family. It actually took about 6 months before he got a break and was introduced to someone from the Colombo crime family. There, he started working for Gilly Greca and his crew, an outfit that got most of their money from stealing and hijacking. This wasn't really the higher echelons of Mafia crews, but it was a start. The funny thing is, because he was so undercover, the New York cops soon had a file on him. That file said he was a crook and a new addition to the Greca crew, named Don Brasco. Then he got another break and met a man with a violent temper and a will to kill. That man was Anthony "Tony" Mira, and he was part of the Bonanno crime family. Now, things got serious because Tony was known for his temper. It's thought he killed 30 to 40 people during his criminal career. Brasco worked more closely with other members of the family, including Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano and Benjamin "Lefty Guns" Ruggiero. He developed a close friendship with the latter, and this is how the many exploits of the Mafia got back to the FBI. During this time, life was filled with patches of boredom and loneliness. Months and years passed and he had no real friends or anyone to love or confide in. It was a dangerous job, but one of the worst aspects of working undercover was basically not being able to be you and enjoy unadulterated emotions. When it came to the more dangerous side of this life, Brasco was never involved in things like big shootouts and he never had to whack a guy. He just played a part, stayed in character, and listened. Of course, he had to witness violence though. Unlike some undercover agents that would follow, Brasco never lost sight of who he was. While he acted well, he was always aware that he was an FBI agent and his friendships were not real. He might laugh and joke around with them and the laughter wasn't fake, but he also knew that one bad move would mean those guys laughing with him would fix him a pair of cement boots and send him for a swim in the Hudson. He also had a wife and kids who depended on him. They knew nothing about what he was doing and he only got to see them once every few months. At one point, he had a car trunk filled with Christmas gifts and was about to go home to his family, but then he bumped into some of its crew and they took him out on a wild night. He had to play the part. The guys in this crew thought Donnie was a bachelor and would be spending Christmas alone in his room. They sympathized with the man. They even visited him at his room and brought a surprise Christmas tree, after which they helped him decorate it. What are you gonna do? It's Christmas time. Bada bing, bada boom. There was even one time when Brasco's wife had a near-fatal car accident and he had to go missing for several days. Upon returning, he couldn't show sadness and had to make up a story as to where he'd been. One of the scariest aspects of the job as time went by was when he was summoned to a mob meeting. Every single time he showed up, he wondered if his real identity had been exposed and he would get whacked there and then. On another occasion, he and Lefty were blamed for messing up a job and he could have been taken out for that, but instead they let him off. Brasco ended up in Florida, where he ran quite a successful operation. At this point, the ill-tempered Mira had just gotten out of jail and discovered that Brasco was making a lot of cash. He demanded part of that, seeing as it was him that gave him his start. This was also a troublesome time when lives were on the line. But when he was alone with Sonny or Lefty, much of the time they just lived like normal friends. They didn't always talk about Mafia stuff. You have to remember, this went on for years and years. And while movies or TV might depict Brasco's life as being crime 24 hours a day, it just wasn't like that. Most of the time was spent sitting at home watching TV or going to the bar and playing cards. Brasco didn't know too much about the inner workings of the crime family because he wasn't a made man. You know, what you need to know is how the Mafia dealt with things. They knew very well that in New York City you are never more than a few feet away from a rat. From time to time things slipped though, and a big break for Brasco is when Sonny told him about 3 captains that had been whacked. They'd been told to come to a meeting, and when they got there they were shot by Lefty and other men. Sonny was now confiding in Brasco, which was good and bad. The downside to becoming a closer member of the family was doing what family members did, and that was dealing in violence and sometimes murder. Sonny said to Brasco, "I need you to take out a person, but you know what? I'm gonna try and make you a made man. You'll be one of us. We're gonna make some serious money." He was now in too deep for his own good. 1, because killing someone was too extreme an act to follow, and 2, because now he was so close to Sonny, he was a target for the people he was supposedly warring against. He might get taken out both as a wise guy and in the line of duty. It was too much. The FBI pulled him out. The aftermath was, to say the least, chaotic. And at first, Brasco's old crew didn't believe the truth. They thought this was some kind of wicked lie, a trap laid by the FBI. They soon discovered it wasn't a lie, and Donnie Brasco, their friend and associate, had never existed. Sonny was soon murdered for getting too close to Brasco and not unearthing the truth. Lefty ended up in prison. Mira went into hiding. But things weren't looking too good because the Bonanno family boss, one Joseph Massino, had ordered his murder. A Mafia soldier named Joseph D'Amico did the business in the end, shooting him a few times in the head. Ironically, D'Amico would also later become an informant. As for what happened during the job, his friendships made. Pistone once said, "I had no sense of guilt. All during the course of the operation, I knew it was a job." He did later say, though, that he didn't want his old comrades to be killed. He only wanted them imprisoned. The Mafia put a $500,000 contract out on Pistone's life, and to counter what some people believe, he says it's never been rescinded. He and his family live with false names which they change occasionally. No one knows where they are, and they certainly stay away from locations where there is a mafia presence. Time might have passed, but Pistone believes there'll be some big shot out there who wants to say he was the man who took down the FBI's most famous undercover cop. November 22, 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's open-top Lincoln Continental limousine drives through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Crowds are ecstatic, cheering, holding flags aloft, and taking photos. Nellie Connolly, the First Lady of Texas, who's also in the car, turns around to the president and says, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Filled with joyousness, the president replies, "No, you certainly can't." Moments later, as the car passes the Texas School Book Depository, shots ring out. The president's hands move toward his neck as he leans forward and a little to the left. His wife Jackie grabs hold of him. Another shot hits him in the head. Jackie, utterly distraught, cries, "They've killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." This was one of the most shocking events in U.S. history, and not without controversy. For many years after, right up until today in fact, various theories have been put forward as to how it actually happened and who exactly did it. However, one man, and one man only, was ever charged with the crime, and that was Lee Harvey Oswald. You've all heard the name. You've likely heard some of the countless conspiracy theories about the assassination, but we guess not so many of you know much about the man who is said to have pulled the trigger. Today you're going to meet him, and you're also going to ask yourself what would drive a person to do such a thing. That's something you can tell us at the end of the video. Lee Harvey Oswald is born on October 18, 1939. He doesn't have the best start in life since his father dies of a heart attack just 2 months into his life. The family, now the mother named Marguerite, young Lee and his two half-brothers John and Robert, are thrust into poverty. Those kids move around in the city of New Orleans, from orphanages to children's homes to boarding schools. Not having a father figure around, young Oswald's development is what you might call strangled. As his older brothers once said, very early on he learned that he wasn't wanted. We weren't wanted. Mother was always alienating herself from us. When he's 12, Marguerite takes him to New York City, where they live in a rundown area in the Bronx. He's pretty much asked to take care of himself as his mother goes out to work. He hardly goes to school at all. Instead, he hangs around the zoo and rides the subway system. It's at the zoo where one day a truant officer sees him. Oswald is not happy about being found out, calling the officer a damned Yankee. He ends up in a detention center called the Youth House, and while there he has a psychiatric evaluation. He's said to live a vivid fantasy life and possibly has some kind of personality disorder. One thing's for sure, the kid desperately needs some love and attention. His social worker confirms this, saying he is emotionally frozen, having never really developed a relationship with anyone. You get the feeling of a kid nobody gave a darn about, says the social worker. In his early teens, he has an awakening. He's walking down the street when an old woman hands him a pamphlet. It's socialist in ethos and has in it two folks named Julius and Eiffel Rosenberg. Those two are sentenced to death in the US for spying for Russia. Sometime later, Oswald writes in his diary, "I was looking for a key to my environment, and then I discovered socialist literature. I had to dig for my books in the back dusty shelves of libraries." He writes this to the Socialist Party of America. "I'm 16 years of age and I would like more information about your youth league. I would like to know if there's a branch in my area, how to join, etc. I am Marxist and have been studying socialist principles for well over 15 months. Later, after running from the clutches of truant officers, Oswald and his mother return to New Orleans. They live in an area beset with poverty and vice, something that affects young Oswald deeply. Drug addicts, prostitutes, violent crime, pervasive racism, dilapidated housing, oppressive cops, no help for the poor, and no opportunities for those not born with silver spoons. He's taking it all in, guided by his socialist sympathies. At age 16, he becomes a cadet with the Civil Air Patrol. He also tries to join the Army but is turned down for being too young. This doesn't stop him from memorizing from back to front the Marine Manual. The obvious question is, why does this budding communist want to join the US military during a very Cold War with the commies? This is a kid who tells a friend he wants to kill the President Eisenhower for exploiting the working class. This is a boy who regularly showers praise on the Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev. One day, a friend's father kicks him out of his house because he's expounding the communist doctrine and saying communism was the only way of life for a worker. It seems his reason is he just needs to get away from his mother. That, or it's the fact his father had been a Marine and his brother has joined up. The Warren Commission later wrote, his study of communist literature, which might appear to be inconsistent with his desire to join the Marines, could have been another manifestation of Oswald's rejection of his environment. You should also remember he's a boy who just wants to be accepted. So at age 17, he becomes a Marine. Nothing much changes though. He makes a few friends and not so many people like him. He isn't really seen as mentally unstable, but he just doesn't fit in. Nor does he ever rise above above the rank of private first class. Still, he knows something about foreign affairs because he reads voraciously. At times, he picks fights with officers, according to one soldier, so he could come out top dog. This kid still hates authority with a vengeance, but he's also smart and can be likable to certain people. One day, he shocks some folks listening to his rants by saying all the Marine Corps did was to teach you to kill, and after you got out of the Marines, you might be good gangsters. During this stint in the Marines, he has 2 court-martials. One for having an unauthorized pistol he accidentally shoots himself with. His other court-martial is for calling an officer out to fight him. He still holds sympathies towards the Soviet Union, and he even teaches himself some Russian, albeit he's not very good. He gets taken off active duty to look after a sick mother, but then he decides he's going to go to Russia. For that decision, he's undesirably discharged. So there he is, in Russia, telling people how much he loves the Soviet Union in his rudimentary Russian. He tries to apply for citizenship and is turned down. This is what he writes in a letter to his brother. "I've been a pro-communist for years, and yet I have never met a communist. Instead, I kept silent and observed. And what I observed plus my Marxist learning brought me here to the Soviet Union. I've always considered this country to be my own." He also writes this: "In the event of war, I would kill any American who put a uniform on in defense of the American government. Any American." Just before his visa runs out and he's about to leave the country, he cuts himself on purpose, after which he's taken to a psychiatric facility. He actually can't believe that the country he's given his heart to has snubbed him. In his diary, he writes, "I am shocked." He says his dream has been shattered because one solitary official has taken it upon himself to turn his visa down. He finishes an entry in his diary with these words: "I decide to end it. Soak fist in cold water to numb pain, then slash my left wrist, then plug wrist into bathtub of hot water. Somewhere a violin plays as I watch my life whirl away. I think to myself, how easy to die, and a sweet death." When he gets out of the hospital, he goes straight to the American embassy. He has a signed note with him, which he hands over to an official. On it are the words, "I, Lee Harvey Oswald, do hereby request that my present citizenship in the United States of America be revoked." He says he wants this for political reasons. He's a Marxist now, and damn American poverty and the life he lived as a kid. He says the only real reason he joined the Marines was that he wanted to have a chance to observe American imperialism. He writes in his diary, "I'm sure Russians will accept me after this sign of my faith in them." He's right. He's allowed to stay. But does he then become a tool of the Soviet government? Is he hired as a spy? Is he trained as an assassin? Perhaps not. And later investigations will say that. Not only that the Russians are obviously a bit suspicious of him, so the KGB follow him around a lot and plant bugs in his house. Oswald is actually working for neither side. He's sent to work as a lathe operator at an electronics firm in Minsk. Over there, he's given quite a good wage packet and lives in an apartment that's better than most people's places. Still, his distrust of authority doesn't change. He talks about the oppressive Soviets. Communist Party officials, he writes, are given benefits that he believes they shouldn't receive. His conclusion is that they are fat, stinking politicians over there just like we have over here. In January of 1961, he writes in his diary, "I'm starting to reconsider my desire about staying. The work is drab, the money I get has nowhere to be spent, no nightclubs or bowling alleys, no places of recreation except the trade union dances. I've had enough." He subsequently gets in touch with the US Embassy and says he wants to come home. Prior to that happening, he has a whirlwind romance with a 19-year-old pharmacology student named Marina Prusakova. After 6 weeks, they marry, and around a year later, they have their first child. Not long after, the three of them land on American soil, ready to live out the American dream. But something happens on Oswald's return. He suddenly becomes not himself, not the man Prusakova knows. He's become easily enraged, irritable, she later told the court. After coming to the United States, Lee changed. "I did not know him as such a man in Russia. What has happened to him? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Maybe his demons have caught up with him. This is a young man who's had psychological problems as a child. He's trained in the Marines, and that hasn't helped. He's tried moving to the Soviet Union, and that hasn't helped either. Here's a man that now detests both communism and capitalism." This is evident in this writing, of which one diary goes like this: "No man, having lived under the Russian communist and American capitalist system, could possibly make a choice between them. There is no choice. One offers oppression, the other poverty. He believes there can be another system, one which doesn't have the shortfalls of capitalism and one which isn't a corrupt and twisted form of Marxism." He writes that he hates the mass exterminations of Stalin and how communism oppresses people. He equally detests what he considers a corrupt form of capitalism in the US. He gets a job as a sheet metal worker, but he soon leaves that. He then starts working as a photoprint trainee, but is fired after wrangling one too many people when waxing about his beliefs. He isn't very good at the job either. But what really peeves his fellow employees is the fact that one day he brings to work a Russian-language newspaper. His employer said the newspaper incident wasn't the only reason he was let go, but it didn't do him any good. Oswald is gets rejected once again. Is he now ready to put his hand on the trigger? In March 1963, he pays $29.95 for a second-hand 6.5mm Carcano rifle. He buys himself a revolver, too. The next month, retired U.S. Major General Edwin Walker is sitting at his desk in his home in Dallas when suddenly there's a loud crash. He's injured after bullet fragments connect with his arm. To investigators, it looks like an assassination attempt, and it is. One it will turn out that was undertaken by Lee Harvey Oswald. This isn't discovered until later, though. Why has he done it? Oswald despises Walker for his far right-wing sentiments, his anti-communist stance, and his racist attitude. According to his wife, he believes that if someone had killed Hitler in time, it would have saved many lives. He thought he was doing the right thing. The family moves to New Orleans, where Oswald becomes more infatuated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. There, he distributes leaflets supporting Cuba, and even though he gets on the radio twice, he doesn't really garner that much attention for the movement. Not only that, Cuban exiles can't stand him. It seems Oswald is as much concerned about getting attention for himself as he is for the plight of Cuba. His wife later said in court he wanted to be arrested. I think he wanted to get into the newspapers so that he would be well known. He then tries to get to Cuba via Mexico. In Mexico, he pleads to the officials at the Cuban embassy saying he supports the cause and can he have a visa. He says he's also intending to return to the former Soviet Union. After speaking with officials and even the KGB, he's turned down. The Cubans say he'll do more harm than good for the cause. So now, it's just days before JFK is gunned down in the street. His heavily pregnant wife is happy when he returns from Mexico, seeing as he is in a pleasant mood and treats her well. He seems like his old self again. She said later in court, he helped me more, although he always did help, adding that he was delighted about the prospect of having a second child with her. Strange, because he's about to give it all up. It's this kind of fact that will later give birth to 1,000 conspiracies. Around this time, Oswald's told about a job that's going at the Texas School Book Depository, and after an interview on October 16th, he's hired there for $1.25 an hour. It's now just over a month before the fateful day. He's apparently pretty good at his job, things are looking up, and then his second child is born. Life couldn't be any better, on paper anyway. He still argues with his wife at times. Because of his radical left activities, he's now on the radar of the FBI. Agents visit his house, but he isn't there. They go again, and he isn't home. With feathers ruffled, Oswald goes to the FBI office in Dallas and asks to speak with the man on his case, James P. Hosty. Hosty isn't available, so Oswald leaves a note. That note, people later say, included a threat that said, "Stop bothering me or I'll blow up the FBI and the Dallas Police Department." Hosty later said there was no such threat, and the note actually read, "If you have anything you would like to learn about me, come talk to me directly. If you don't cease bothering my wife, I will take the appropriate action and report this to the proper authorities." Does that sound like the words of a soon-to-be killer? The night before the assassination, Oswald goes to bed before his wife. When she later retires, he says nothing to her, even though she's pretty sure he's awake. When she wakes in the morning, he's gone. His wedding ring is sitting inside a cup on the dresser. $170 is in a wallet in a drawer. He's only taken $13.87 with him, hardly enough to flee the country. The next day, after JFK is fatally injured, Oswald is seen in the second-floor lunchroom by a cop who has a gun drawn on him. Oswald's supervisor is also there, so Oswald's allowed to walk on. He appears calm. Not long after, Oswald is apprehended after a short altercation in a movie theater. During questioning, he's forthcoming and seems composed. He denies all wrongdoing. He says he's a patsy, meaning he thinks he's being framed. The evidence against him is overwhelming. He's seen by multiple witnesses shooting and killing a policeman when walking down a street. When he's arrested in the movie theater, he says the words, "Well, it's all over now." But this isn't another JFK assassination story. It's a "Who was Lee Harvey Oswald" story. So then why did he pull that trigger? It's not easy to ascertain the answer. Far from it. He was shot and killed 2 days later by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, while being escorted through Dallas Police Headquarters. Ruby himself was later treated by the CIA's brainwashing specialist, Louis Joylan West, and diagnosed with psychosis. That's a story to get conspiracy theorists excited. While behind bars, Ruby got in touch with the Warren Commission and said, "I want to tell the truth, and I can't tell it here." Nothing came of it, and Ruby died not too long after losing his mind. Was anyone else involved in the assassination, from abroad or at home? We just don't know. Theories range from the spectacular to the heavily rejected Oswald, often insecure, having argued with his wife and just gone off the deep end. Maybe he just wanted to become the center of the world. Maybe he really thought he could help society, or perhaps, as many theories go, the Mafia was involved, the KGB was involved, the Soviets were involved, or the Cubans were involved. If you like rabbit holes, this is a deep one. Polls show that way more Americans believe he was part of some kind of conspiracy rather than acting alone. Was he an insecure guy that managed to shock the world without any help, or was he a pawn in a much bigger game? The date is August 14th, 1961. The location, a dingy basement in the American Central Intelligence Agency's West Berlin headquarters. Just a few miles distant lies the Soviet KGB's own headquarters, both sides separated by a political demarcation splitting Germany and to east under influence of the Soviet Union and the democratic west under the protection of the United States and its allies. For years, a secret spy war has waged between both sides, the life of each operative always just a single trigger pull away from ending. Or at least that's what the man claims to be and want. He appears to be in his late 30s or early 40s, a tall, handsome man with dark hair, a clean-shaven face, and an easy-going manner. Nothing about him screams assassin, and yet the man insists that he is one responsible for at least 2 major political assassinations on the Soviet side of Europe. The American agents interrogating him are skeptical. The West German intelligence officer assisting his American partners is less skeptical. "Go on," the German officer nods. "Tell us how it happened." Stashinsky takes a sip of water and clears his throat. It's now October 1957 and the weather is pleasantly cool. Stashinsky sits on a park bench in the middle of Munich, newspaper on his lap. To all appearances, he's nothing more than another German citizen enjoying the mild weather. In reality, he's a dangerous predatory animal, carefully eyeballing every man who crosses his path. He's looking for his prey, and he knows he'll find him soon. Originally, Stashinsky was instructed to abduct Lev Rebet, the editor of a Ukrainian nationalistic newspaper that called for the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. Needless to say, this didn't sit well with the Soviet government, and with the paper's growing influence, something had to be done to stop the agitators. 6 months after his original tasking to abduct Rebet, the KGB changed its mind and encouraged the assassination of Rebet instead. The Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev personally approved of the killing, and soon Stashinsky found himself with different orders: kill Lev Rebet and leave no witnesses. Stashinsky watches the crowd carefully as it moves. He's been here in the city center for 2 days, knowing that eventually Rebet will appear. He doesn't have to wait long, and early on the second day, Stashinsky spots Rebet from a distance as he steps off a train and immediately picks up his newspaper and begins to follow him. Rebet has only minutes left to live now. Hidden in the rolled-up newspaper is a very simple device, a single-shot, single-barreled pipe gun of sorts, loaded with a nearly foolproof tool for assassination, a capsule of potassium cyanide. The weapon fires the capsule directly into the face of its victim, which bursts on impact, releasing a small cloud of the deadly poison. Within seconds, the victim will be unconscious. Moments later, dead, and best of all, any medical examination that doesn't look too closely will determine the cause of death to be nothing more than a simple heart attack. Now, Stashinsky follows Rebet, the deadly weapon hidden in his newspaper. On an ankle holster, Stashinsky carries a small revolver just in case there are any witnesses. Nobody can be left alive to tell the tale of Rebet's death, and certainly not to link it back to the people who most want him dead, the Soviet Union. Rebet leads Stashinsky through the streets of Berlin, finally arriving at his apartment block. He opens the front door and lets himself in, Stashinsky slipping in behind him just before the door closes. Rebet begins to climb the stairs to the second floor, completely unaware of the deadly assassin stalking his every step. Stashinsky clears his throat. The surprised Rebet immediately spins around to face him, only to stare into the barrel of the deadly poison gun. With a silent hiss, the weapon fires, a potassium cyanide capsule bursting directly in Rebet's face. Rebet staggers forward, but falls to the floor. The assassination has been perfect. No witnesses, and the medical examiners will discover only a small amount of potassium cyanide in Rebet's system. Not enough to trigger suspicions that his death was anything but natural. Back in 1961, the CIA officers looked skeptical. A poison gun that shoots potassium cyanide capsules? That sounds ridiculous to them. Pure fantasy. They're growing less and less convinced by the minute that this man is truly who he says he is, let alone a Soviet assassin. The German officer, however, isn't so sure. An autopsy of Rebet did discover potassium cyanide in his system, and the same was discovered in another prominent political enemy of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. Could the two be connected? Tell me more, Herr Stashinsky. It's once more October, but this time it's 1959, 2 years after the assassination of Lev Rebet. Today, the target is another Ukrainian antagonist, a political leader now living in exile from his former home and still calling for independence from the Soviet Union, Stepan Bandera. This has naturally placed him in the crosshairs of the KGB. Bandera lives in Munich on an apartment block at Kreitmeyer Street, not far from his office. Stashinsky has been watching Bandera closely for months. The man is not easy to track or to approach. Bandera is all too aware that he has a target on his back and has been careful to mix up his routines and maintain tight security at all times. This has made pinning down his commute and best places to ambush him very difficult. Stashinsky has already tried to penetrate Bandera's home on a previous occasion, but the lockpicking tools provided him by the KGB failed to open the lock on the front door of the apartment building. He tried his own key to see if perhaps they were similar enough, but that too failed and actually broke off in the lock. Panicked, Stashinsky called off the assassination attempt, fearful that the sabotaged lock might give the plot away. Lucky for him, the building inspector fixed the lock and suspected no foul play. Bandera remained unaware of just how close he had come to death. Stashinsky was determined to kill him on his first trip though, and as he followed closely from behind through the streets of Munich, Bandera happened to glance behind him and spot Stashinsky, making the assassin fear he'd been made. The hit was called off. But now, weeks later, Stashinsky is determined to at last get his victim. He's filed down one of his own keys to match the lock to Bandera's apartment building door, and he undertakes a quick trial run to ensure it works. Sure enough, the key fits and the door opens. The assassination is a go. The next day, Stashinsky takes a yellow pill meant to protect him from potassium cyanide he'd be using to kill Bandera with. His weapon is an improved version of the one he used 2 years ago, featuring 2 barrels which will allow him to ensure a deadly dose is delivered. The assassin makes his way to the Ludwig Bridge near the German Museum in Munich, and from there finds a place to observe the Ukrainian émigré office. He spots Bandera's car, and about an hour later, at 11:30 hours, Stashinsky watches a man and a woman exit the office and enter Bandera's vehicle, driving down the street. He's not close enough to identify the man, but is convinced it's Bandera. Stashinsky decides to simply wait for Bandera at his home and takes a streetcar to the apartment building Bandera lives in under a fake name. He finds a place to sit and observe the street, and not long after, spots Bandera's car drive past him. Bandera, who is typically escorted by a bodyguard everywhere he goes, is completely alone. Now is the time to strike. Stashinsky watches Bandera drive into the apartment building's garage and quickly makes his way inside the building using his filed-down key. He heads up the stairs and takes a perch in between the ground and second floor. It's still early in the afternoon and the building is quiet. There's no foot traffic coming or going. Perfect for an assassination. Suddenly, there's the sound of a door opening somewhere above Stashinsky and 2 women bidding goodbye to each other. Stashinsky tries to calm his nerves and wills the woman to quickly move to the elevator and take her leave. She doesn't. She decides to take the stairs. Stashinsky grips the weapon hidden in his newspaper roll. It has 2 barrels, 2 charges. He could kill 2 people with it if need be. The woman draws nearer, and at the last second, Stashinsky decides against killing her. He moves down the stairs and begins to fiddle with the elevator button, pretending to be waiting for it. The woman passes him and exits the building. The moment the door closes behind her, Stashinsky curses silently and rushes back toward the stairs. But before he can take more than 2 steps toward the stairs, the front door once more opens. It's Bandera, and he's spotted Stashinsky. For one brief moment, the assassin fears that the game is up. Maybe Bandera will run. Maybe he'll reach for his weapon. Stashinsky is only armed with the poison gun, useless except at point-blank range. Bandera would surely kill him before he could get that close. It's well known that the Ukrainian leader in exile always carries a firearm in a shoulder holster. The question racing through Stashinsky's mind is, does he recognize me? Did he spot me weeks ago as I was following him and he happened to glance over his shoulder directly at me? Will he remember my face? Bandera does not. He nods briefly at Stashinsky before turning his attention back to extricating his key from the front door. His arms are loaded with groceries, and he's having trouble removing the key from the sticky lock. His back turned to the deadly Soviet assassin standing only a dozen feet away. Stashinsky makes his move. It's now or never. Walking to the door, Stashinsky grabs the front door knob as if to help Bandera. "Doesn't it work?" asks Stashinsky, causing Bandera to look directly at him. "Yeah, it works," comes the reply. As Bandera turns to look and answer Stashinsky's question, he's met by both barrels of the poison gun. 2 capsules of potassium cyanide burst at point-blank range in Bandera's face, and the Ukrainian leader staggers backwards. Groceries fall to the floor as Bandera struggles to free his pistol from its holster hidden under his jacket. It's too late for him though. Stashinsky doesn't even wait to confirm Bandera's death. He walks out the door and closes it behind him as Bandera falls to the floor. The massive dose of poison takes only seconds to kill him. The police will find him with his hand still clutching at the weapon in its holster. Back in 1961 once more, the Americans still aren't buying it. A poison gas gun? Whoever heard of such a thing? What a load of hooey. The CIA agents don't believe Stashinsky or his stories and make a recommendation to headquarters that he is useless as a double agent and is possibly a Soviet mole himself. His stories don't add up, and the CIA releases him to the West German intelligence service. The Germans, however, aren't as skeptical of Stashinsky's stories. They have Stashinsky walk them through a recreation of the murders and become increasingly convinced that he's the real deal. given his incredible familiarity with the murder scenes. Maybe he can be a valuable intelligence asset. But first, he has to answer for his crimes. As a valuable asset, Stashinsky is jailed for only 8 years. Shortly after his release, the CIA changes its mind on Stashinsky and brings him into the fold. They eventually provide new identities for him and his German wife and fly them to South Africa, where he's granted asylum. But not before he delivers a goldmine of intelligence to the West on Soviet operations. You've taken up a job as a New York City window washer. Congratulations, it's an honorable profession. Sure, you can be performing death-defying feats of cleaning for a starting wage as little as $12 an hour. But underappreciated as you are, you have a vital job, and you're more committed to maintaining transparency than most world governments. On your first day, you faced a daunting challenge: cleaning the windows on the 47th floor of a New York City skyscraper. I hope you're not afraid of heights. But while you're busy with the thin Windex line between cleanliness and grime, disaster strikes. You lose your footing and tumble 472 feet to the unforgiving concrete below. You probably assume your next step is being scraped up and power washed into a gutter, but nope, you survived. You will live to wash windows another day. Seems far-fetched, right? But this actually happened to 37-year-old veteran New York window washer Alcides Moreno in 2017. We're going to tell you the incredible story of how he survived the seemingly unsurvivable today. First, let's talk about Moreno. He arrived from the US from Ecuador in the 1990s with his wife Rosario and his 3 children. This is a man who's truly committed to his job, and more than that, he downright loves it. When interviewed about his profession after his life-defining accident, he said, "I love to see the windows really clean. I liked the water and the soap, how you press the squeegee. We'd start at the top and clean all the way to the bottom. I loved it." It was with this intensely positive mindset that he and his younger brother, 30-year-old Edgar Moreno, took on the Solo Tower apartment block in Manhattan's Upper East Side. At 50 stories and 689 feet, it's a formidable structure, although still only the 71st tallest building in New York. The Moreno brothers took the elevator to the top floor with all their equipment. The roof was dizzyingly high, even for those experienced window washers. The temperature was freezing, the air was thin, but this was nothing unusual for this line of work, so they just got on with it. Alcides and Edgar Moreno climbed into their 16-foot-wide, 1,250-pound cleaning platform and prepared for another honest day's work. But this wasn't just any other day. A nightmarish disaster was about to strike. When the 2 brothers climbed onto the platform, forgetting to first put on and fasten their safety harnesses, the powerful cables that held the whole operation in place came dangerously loose. First, the cable on the left side, the side where Edgar Moreno was standing, came free, causing the entire platform to droop on one side and fling Edgar off the platform entirely. Sadly, this isn't the inspiring tale of how 2 brothers survived the terrifying situation. Edgar fell 472 feet, reaching speeds of around 120 miles per hour, before landing in a narrow alley. He landed on a wooden fence, severing his body in 2 and killing him instantly. Edgar's death is one of the 420,000 deaths that occur through falling every single year. It's one of the most common accidental ways to die. But Alcides didn't have time to think about this. His mind was more focused on his own seemingly imminent mortality. His side of the scaffolding came loose and began to hurtle down toward the ground like a screaming comet. However, unlike the tragic end of his brother, firefighters found Alcides alive in the hunk of twisted metal that was once the window washing platform. Crouched down, fingers twisted in a death grip around the platform, having survived by virtue of not striking his head during the fall. According to witness reports, Alcides even attempted to stand. The first responders were amazed as they were baffled to find him alive, but Alcides was still in grave danger. He may have survived the fall, but it wasn't by much. While he was certainly luckier than Edgar, his injuries were nonetheless extensive and life-threatening. Alcides had suffered a traumatic head injury that left him with brain damage, as well as damage to his neck, spinal column, chest, and abdomen. He also had fractures to his right arm, ribs, and both legs. Alcides was practically on the edge of death. The firefighters slowly and gently handled him into the vehicle for transport to a nearby hospital 4 blocks away. When Alcides arrived at the hospital, he was given extensive treatment for his injuries. He was put into an induced coma, and he had a catheter inserted into his brain to reduce dangerous swelling. The doctors cut open his abdomen in order to relieve the pressure on his organs. He was also transfused 24 pints of donated blood, which is around twice his entire blood volume. But the treatments didn't stop there. He was also given 19 pints of plasma, platelets, and a drug to stimulate blood clotting in order to reduce reduce his life-threatening hemorrhaging. He was also given a tracheotomy surgery and a ventilator in his throat, as well as 9 different orthopedic surgeries. Alcides' condition was so fragile throughout most of this process that the doctors couldn't even move him onto the operating theater. When later discussing the nature of Alcides' recovery, Dr. Herbert Pardes, who was president and CEO of New York Presbyterian Hospital at the time, said, "If you're looking for a medical miracle, this certainly qualifies." And Dr. Pardes wasn't exaggerating there either. According to the chief surgeon of New York Presbyterian, Dr. Philip Bari, the death rate from falling 3 stories is around 50%. At 10 stories, the amount of people who survive are statistically insignificant. Alcides was a complete statistical outlier. Alcides Moreno remained in his medically induced coma for 3 weeks. He finally spoke on December 7th of 2007 to Rosario, who'd remained in his room and kept him company throughout the recovery process. Because of the head trauma Alcides experienced, he didn't even remember the accident happening. He did, however, deduce that his brother had died. Still, in spite of his brother's tragic death, Alcides Moreno was lucky enough to be alive after the whole ordeal. After a few more spinal surgeries and another surgery to help reconstruct his abdominal wall, he'd almost fully recovered. Naturally, the authorities looked into what might have caused the accident in the first place. The investigations into the circumstances of the incident found that the platform and cables hadn't been properly maintained over time, and the new motorized cables responsible for lowering the platform down the side of the building hadn't been properly anchored to the top of the building. It was a perfect recipe for the worst-case scenario. Initially, the investigators also placed some of the responsibility for the accident on Alcides and Edgar, claiming that the fact that they weren't wearing their harnesses during the accident made them at least somewhat culpable for what happened. However, this line of reasoning was later dropped because the investigators couldn't prove that the brothers weren't just testing the platform before applying their harnesses and getting back on. Anyway, back to the story. The real question on everyone's mind right now is how Alcides Moreno survived falling 472 feet from the 47th floor of the Solo building. The answer is honestly still unclear. Many doctors and first responders believe that by all rights Alcides should be absolutely dead right now. But some possibilities can be found in science and in Moreno's basic window washer training. When asked about why he thought he was able to survive the ordeal, he credited the fact that he was trained to lay flat to the platform and cling onto it during his sudden descent toward the New York City streets below. The much larger surface area of the platform Alcides was clinging to likely offered air resistance that slowed the speed of his descent, compared to his brother. Edgar's relatively small surface area had him fire down toward the earth like a bullet with little resistance. The physics of air resistance gave Alcides a fighting chance against the forces of gravity. Some speculated that perhaps the platform bounced against one of the surrounding buildings, slowing the fall, though this was never conclusively proved. The platform itself may have also acted as a kind of buffer between the force of the crash and Alcides' body, both dampening the overall force and distributing it evenly across his body. Edgar, on the other hand, took the full force of the fall himself on the razor edge of a fence, essentially assuring catastrophic physical damage. Alcides and Edgar essentially provide perfect examples of ideal and nightmare scenarios for falling from a great height without a parachute. We could look at a few similar examples to see if they provide any answers for how someone could survive such an insane fall. Joshua Hansen, a bar owner from Wisconsin, drunkenly crashed out of the window of a Minneapolis hotel's 17th floor. Hansen suffered a broken leg and a collapsed lung but walked away fine from the hospital a week later. This is still a miraculous feat of survival, but Alcides fell 30 floors more, so it's a little difficult to compare the two. Likewise, Tim Stillwell is thankfully still well after falling from the roof of his apartment building in 2013. His fall was broken by the roof of a nearby building, allowing him to survive with some broken bones. While having a more solid scientific answer would certainly be more satisfying than maintaining the mystery, the fact is the greatest factor in surviving any insane fall is pure luck. There's no one solid logical reason that Alcides Moreno was able to survive his 47-story fall, baffling everyone from scientists to doctors to first responders. Alcides and Rosario attribute a lot of his tremendous luck to the grace of God, owing to the fact that Alcides, in the words of Rosario, has never wished anything bad on anyone. In the aftermath of the incident, Edgar Moreno was buried in the brothers' home country of Ecuador. In the few years following, Alcides struggled greatly with survivor's guilt. He'd been close with his brother his whole life, the two of them having lived together in New Jersey and worked as a team since the early 90s. Alcides said, "Losing him was a big deal for me. I believe I felt melancholic for about 3 years. That's how long it took me to recover and accept his death. It was like losing a child because he was younger than me." While nothing could bring back Alcides' brother, he did at least achieve some financial justice for the company that caused his death. Rather than implicating Alcides and Edgar in their own tragedy, a Manhattan Supreme Court judge ruled in their favor, finding Tractel, the company responsible for installing the safety features on the window washing platform, liable for poorly installing the motorized cables. They also found that the Solo building was liable for its inadequate safety features. As a result, the two entities settled the matter with Alcides out of court for a large sum of money. Alcides Morena has since moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and had a fourth child with Rosario. Morena said that the warm, dry air in Arizona is better for his bones, but he still misses the people of New York City. He no longer works for health reasons, but has maintained that he doesn't have a fear of heights because of the incident. Looking back on his experience, Alcides said, "I have all the scars on my body, and because of the back injuries, I can't run, only walk. I'm not like I used to be, but thank God I can walk. That's amazing for me." And Alcides has put his life and ability to walk to good use. In the years since his accident, he supported his children in going to college and taken part in 5K runs for charity. While he said that life could never truly be the same, he's regained around 80% of the person he used to be. And for someone who fell to what seemed like certain death from the top of a 50-story building, 80% is honestly pretty darn good. It was July 9, 1958, and an earthquake on the Fairweather Fault in the Alaska Panhandle rattled for about 1 minute. It was the strongest in Alaska for 60 years, and it could be felt as far away as Seattle. The quake sent around 82 million tons of rock into the waters of Lituya Bay. All that rock hitting the water was like an asteroid impact, and the result was the world's tallest mega tsunami, measuring something like 1,720 feet. The giant mass of a wave continued down the bay, taking with it any vegetation on the mountainside. That monster destroyed everything in its path. One man and his son were sleeping in a boat in that bay as all this happened. Through the skin of their teeth, they survived, but others weren't so lucky. Howard Ulrich and his 8-year-old son named Sonny had been catching some Z's on their boat, the Edgery, when the earthquake happened. They'd been out salmon fishing throughout the day and had retired to their bunks. Just after 10 p.m., their bunks started shaking, almost knocking the two guys to the floor. Howard had no idea what had happened, so he got up and went to the deck. The boat was still shaking violently from side to side. Suddenly, there was an eerie calm for about 2.5 minutes, and what followed almost knocked Howard off his feet. He heard a crashing sound that was deafening, which was the rocks hitting the water in the bay. His son joined him on the deck. They both looked into the distance down the bay, and on each side they saw the mountain shuddering, sending snow flying high into the air. Suddenly, the two witnessed a wave coming toward them so large they could hardly believe their eyes. As the wave approached, though, it became smaller. Still, it was racing down the bay at about 120 miles per hour, taking out trees on the mountainside, plucking hundreds from their roots in a matter of seconds. Howard now knew that this was no time for standing around and admiring the power of nature. There was no way this wave was going to stop before it hit their small boat. Howard told Sonny to put on his life preserver and start praying to God Almighty. There was not much he could do to steer the boat out of the way since it was anchored, but he managed to turn on the engine and steer the boat so it was facing the oncoming wave. Had he not done that, the two might not have survived. Howard dropped the anchor as low as it could go, and his last words on the anchor were, "Mayday, Mayday, this is Edgery in the Lituya Bay. All hell has busted loose in here. I think we've had it. Goodbye." The wave was now 1,720 feet when it was close enough for Howard to really see what was coming, but receded to just 100 feet high as it neared. When it finally reached them, the wave was only around 50 to 75 feet high, but that was enough to snap that anchor chain like it was nothing but a fishing line. The boat rose high into the air, riding the wave. With such force, Howard believed that the boat would be thrown to the land and smashed to pieces, but that didn't happen. Once they were over the crest of the wave, there was more danger, because the choppy waters were full of debris that the wave had taken with it. The two weren't out of trouble yet, and little did they know others were in danger too. Unfortunately, not everyone was as lucky as Howard and Sonny and managed to ride the mega tsunami. Some would succumb to the giant wave. There were two other boats in the bay on that historic day, a boat owned by Bill and V. Swanson named the Badger, and a boat named Sunmore owned by another couple, Orville and Mickey Wagner. Both those couples were actually friends and prior to the incident had waved across the water and said hello. When Bill Swanson felt the swaying of the boat, he too got up to see what was happening. He later described what he saw next was like a big load of rocks spilling out of a dump truck. That might have been an understatement, because the rocks that hit the water would have weighed as much as 240 Empire State Buildings. The Swanson's boat was lifted even higher when it was hit by the wave. In Bill's own words, he said, "We went away up over the trees and I looked down on the rocks as big as an ordinary house as we crossed the spit. We were away above them. It felt like we were in a tin can and somebody was shaking it." Looking down at the trees, Bill believed that he was at least 80 feet in the air when on the crest of the wave. That crest broke and the Badger landed quite close to the shoreline. The boat soon began to sink and suddenly trees and other debris flooded it. Bill was hit in the chest and broke a couple of ribs, but both he and his wife didn't go under. The couple, still in their underwear, quickly got in their small dinghy. The water was rough and full of trees, but they managed to use that dinghy to steer out of danger. They were rescued by a fishing boat about 2 hours later. Referring to what he saw that evening right after the earthquake, Bill later said, "People shake their head when I tell them I saw it that night. I can't help it if they don't believe me, but I know what I saw that night." On the opposite side of the bay, the Sunmore and its occupants Orville and Mickey Wagner were not so fortunate. Unlike the other two boats after the earthquake hit, the couple decided to get out of the bay. This might seem like a wise decision, but just as they turned out of the entrance, the wave hit them from the side. The boat flipped and was taken by the wave. The couple did not survive. It could have been a much bigger tragedy though, since two groups of campers consisting of 20 people should have been camping on the shoreline of the bay that evening. Lady Luck must have smiled on them because the two groups had decided for various reasons not to camp. Had they been there when that wave hit, they would have been taken by the waves along with the trees they were camping next to. Howard and Sonny didn't give up fishing, although a year after, Howard retired as a commercial fisherman. Bill and Vi soon recovered from their injuries, but Vi said she'd never get in a boat again. Bill did, and on May 26, 1962, almost 4 years after the accident, he returned to Lituya Bay in his boat, the St. Nicholas. It was the first time he'd been back since the accident. This man, now a 50-year-old in good health, died of a massive heart attack just as soon as his boat passed through the entrance. Looks like the wave got him in the end. You ever had that nightmare where you're naked and everyone's laughing at you? Well, for mountain man John Coulter, the bad dream was real. The hot summer sun beat down on his unmentionable places as a crowd of Blackfoot Indians made crude gestures and taunted him. They'd already killed his partner, and now a group of leaders were deciding his fate. Suddenly, an elder grabbed Coulter's arm and led him away. "Go," said the elder, pointing at the prairie. "Run!" Confused, Coulter staggered forward and then glanced back. The Blackfoot warriors were stretching, limbering up. That's when Coulter realized he was running for his life. Late in the summer of 1809, John Coulter and John Potts left Fort Raymond, also known as Fort Manuel, and ventured into Blackfoot territory near where the Gallatin, Jefferson, and Madison rivers meet. Today, this area is known as Three Forks, Montana. The two men were skilled hunters and planned to trap beavers. They had met a few years before when they'd been members of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Coulter and Potts knew that poaching in Blackfoot territory was extremely dangerous, but a good price was being paid for beaver pelts, so they tried to keep their presence on the down low. They set out beaver traps at night, checked them in the early morning, hid and slept during midday. The two men were each paddling a small dugout canoe up the Jefferson River when they heard a stamping noise. Coulter worried that it was Blackfoot Indians and wanted to turn back, but Potts insisted the noise was buffalo and accused Coulter of cowardice. For the rest of Potts's very short, miserable life, he wished he had listened to Coulter. They paddled around a bend to see that the banks of the river were lined with around 800 Blackfoot, some on horses. The tribe gestured for them to come ashore. Coulter thought it was best to comply. Trying to escape was futile. He furtively cut the lines for his beaver trapping gear, letting it drift to the shallow bottom of the river. He told Potts that he could retrieve it later. Coulter went ashore. He spoke rudimentary Blackfoot and also a little Crow, the language of the neighboring Indian tribe. He thought that he and Potts were just going to be robbed. The Blackfoot took Coulter's gear, his rifle, flint, powder horn, and his knife. Then they made him strip. Off came Coulter's shirt, belt, pants, and boots. Soon he was as naked as the day he was born. Meanwhile, Potts stood in his canoe, long rifle in hand, watching the proceedings and refusing to come ashore. The Blackfoot communicated to Coulter that he should tell Potts to come ashore. Coulter told Potts, but Potts refused, saying that he might as well lose his life rather than be stripped and robbed like Coulter. Prophetic words. An archer on the shore shot Potts in the hip with an arrow. Potts fell to the bottom of his boat. Coulter asked if he was hurt. Potts said yes, he was hurt, too injured to escape. As he rose up from the bottom of his canoe, poised for action, Potts told Coulter to get away if he could. He was going to shoot at least one Indian. Pots fired, killing one Blackfoot. All hell broke loose. A volley of arrows were unleashed at Potts, and in seconds he was dead, riddled with arrows and bullets. Blackfoot jumped in the river and dragged Potts' boat to shore. Raging, they tossed his corpse on the ground. They mutilated his body, hacking it apart with tomahawks and knives. Coulter stood by, head turned away so he didn't see. Some accounts claim that the Blackfoot threw Potts' entrails into Coulter's face to goad him. Either way, soon all that was left of Potts was a bloody, pulpy mess on the ground. An angry warrior came at Coulter with a tomahawk, but his tribesmen grabbed him and held him back. A group of leaders and elders quickly convened to decide what to do with Coulter. Meanwhile, Coulter stood there in his birthday suit, being harassed by the mob. He was sweating, trying to keep a cool head while dreading what was going to happen next. Would the Blackfoot torture him before they killed him? An elder left the council, came over to Coulter, grabbed his arm, and began to walk him away from the crowd. The elder pointed at the prairie. Go away, he told Coulter in Crow. Coulter walked a few steps forward on shaky legs. He thought that the tribe was going to shoot him in the back. The elder impatiently gestured and demanded Coulter go faster. Coulter walked a little faster. When he got maybe 100 yards away, he glanced back to see that the young men of the tribe were stripping off their leggings and stretching. That's when Coulter understood. They were the hunters and he was the prey. He was running for his life. His heart pounding, Coulter took off, running as fast as he could. Seconds later, blood-curdling cries went up as the Blackfoot came chasing after Coulter. Coulter was fleet of foot, he was in good shape, and adrenaline coursed through his body. But every step was painful. The prairie was treacherous. Large swaths of prickly pear bush covered the ground. The tiny spikes from their stickers pierced the tender skin between Coulter's toes. Pebbles tripped him and also bit into his feet. Shrubs scratched and left welts on his calves as he charged through them. Thankfully, Coulter knew the area. He was about 5 miles from the Madison River. If he could just make it there. Coulter ran and ran, not daring to look back. Startled birds flew up from the grass as he bolted past. He could hear war whoops and laughter carrying on the breeze. Also, footsteps. He wasn't sure if the Blackfoot were close on his tail or if it was just the imagination of his terrified mind. Finally, Coulter couldn't bear it any longer. He was out of breath. He had a stitch in his side. His nose had started to bleed from the extreme exertion. Slowing down, he looked back. Coulter had run perhaps 3 miles. Most of the hunters had lost steam and were distant specks on the prairie. However, one graceful runner draped in a blanket and carrying a spear was far ahead of the rest of the pack, maybe around 100 yards behind Coulter. The distance between them was just shy of an American football field. Coulter took off again. The Blackfoot hunter chased him for another mile, slowly gaining ground, getting closer and closer. Heart racing, lungs burning, ears ringing, Coulter could run no more. He stopped and whirled around, arms spread wide, panting, his feet shredded and his nose gushing blood. Coulter pleaded for his life in Crow. The exhausted warrior didn't hear Coulter or didn't care. He ran closer and then lunged at Coulter with his spear, but stumbled and fell, breaking his spear in two. The tables were turned. Suddenly it was the Blackfoot warrior on the ground begging for mercy. Coulter snatched up the half of the spear that had the sharp head and impaled the warrior, pinning him to the ground. Coulter worked the broken spear free of the dying man and stole his blanket. Buoyed by a fresh wave of energy, Coulter turned and ran for the river, which was about a mile away. Coulter gained a little extra time as the Blackfoot stopped to check on their fallen tribesmen. The discovery of their comrade's death sent the Indians into new paroxysms of rage and grief. At the bank of the Madison River, Coulter paused to catch his breath and scanned the area. Slightly downstream, he noticed a huge beaver lodge with a mound of brush, sticks, and river debris rising from the water. Coulter plunged into the river, and golly, it was cold. The water came from snowpack melting further upstream. At least it numbed his swollen, bloody feet. Coulter swam to the beaver lodge and dived down to come up under the wall and enter it. Beaver are clever animals, good at construction. Their lodges are often multi-roomed and 2-story. The interior made watertight by an intricate weave of twigs, grass, and mud. Coulter secreted himself on the dry second level of the ledge. Just in time, the Blackfoot splashed into the river, searching for Coulter. They stood atop the beaver mound, poked spears into it, and argued about which way Coulter went. Coulter lay inches under them, scarcely breathing, worried that the hunters would fall through or set his hiding place on fire. Thankfully, they didn't. Instead, the Blackfoot spread out to comb the area. Several men crossed to the opposite bank to look for him on the other side of the river. Coulter stayed in his hiding place, terrified that they had left someone on watch. The main pack of hunters came back 2 hours later, angry, having not seen hide nor hair of Coulter on the far side of the river. Finally, the Blackfoot left, returning to their tribe. A shivering Coulter decided to play it safe and stayed put until dark. Then he finally left the beaver lodge and swam many miles downstream. Finally, Coulter emerged from the water, chilled to the bone. All he had was the sharp end of a broken spear and a sodden blanket. No food, no clothing, and no gear. He was hundreds of miles from the nearest fort. Worse yet, an angry Blackfoot tribe was probably monitoring the nearby mountain pass. Sure, going through Bozeman Pass and following the Yellowstone River was the quickest route back to Fort Raymond. However, that route would take Coulter through the heart of Blackfoot country. He didn't want to chance it. Coulter took a long detour which added probably 100 miles to his journey, but it was far safer. Coulter walked about 30 miles east toward the Bridger Mountains. To get over the mountain, he climbed a near vertical peak. Hiking through the snow-capped peaks at the top of the mountains was especially hard, as he had only his alone blanket to stay warm. Once over the mountains, Coulter walked across the Great Plains and then through the Montana wilderness. He ate berries, bark, and roots known as prairie turnips, dug up with his hands and the spear point. 11 days and some 300 miles later, Coulter finally arrived back to Fort Raymond. He was naked, sunburned, covered in insect bites, and emaciated. His feet were swollen and blistered, his eyes were glassy, and his beard long and scraggly. Close companions didn't even recognize him. Coulter spent several weeks recuperating from his narrow escape and arduous journey home. Later that winter, Coulter, who was brave, foolish, or insane, or perhaps a bit of all three, headed back into Blackfoot territory. He wanted to retrieve his expensive beaver trapping gear which he had dropped into the river on that terrible summer's day he ended up being hunted. Since it was the dead of winter, Coulter figured he'd be okay. He thought that the Blackfoot would be hunkered down in their camps until spring. Coulter traveled through the Bozeman Pass and reached the Gallatin River. One evening, he was settling down to a nice meal of boiled buffalo meat by his small campfire when his sharp hunter's ears detected the telltale sound of twig snapping. Operating on instinct honed from years of living in the wilderness, Coulter dove down atop his fire, extinguishing it. Muskets cracked and musket balls whined over Coulter's head as he lay in the darkness. Finally, Coulter had enough. He hastily packed up and went back to Fort Raymond, eventually heading east to buy a farm, settle down, and get married. It's August 1819. You're 16 years old and you've just been hired as a deckhand on your first sea voyage. You're preparing for the adventure of your life, but little do you know that you and your crew will soon be stranded at sea, forced to eat each other to survive. The 87-foot-long, 240-ton whaling ship Essex is leaving today for a 2-year, 10,000-mile journey to hunt sperm whales. You grew up on the island of Nantucket, the hub of the thriving whale oil trade, so you've always known you would go into the whaling business like everyone else in your life. As the ship pulls away from port, you stand on the deck and wave goodbye to your family. You can't believe that it'll be 2 years until you see them again, but at least you'll be a sea-tested sailor when you return. Only 2 days after setting sail, you get your first taste of the sea's wrath when a fierce storm comes out of nowhere and nearly sinks the ship. After making some repairs, you continue on your journey down the eastern coast of South America, and 5 weeks later, the Essex arrives in Cape Horn off the southern tip of South America. To you, it feels like you've sailed to the bottom of the world. Unfortunately, the delay from the storm means you arrived late, and you find that the usually fertile hunting waters have been fished out. The captain decides to head toward the Galapagos Islands in the South Pacific in search of whales. After a long trip up the other side of South America, the crew anchors at Charles Island in the Galapagos to restock, where bad luck continues to plague your excursion. A reckless crew member's prank burns the entire island to the ground. You run through the flames and barely escape with your life. Thankfully, no one in the crew is hurt, but the same can't be said for the island's wildlife. You're now responsible for the extinction of the Floriana tortoise and the near extinction of the Floriana mockingbird. Finally, after more than a year at sea, your crew encounters a group of sperm whales. It looks like luck is finally in your favor, or so you think. The experienced crew jumps into action, immediately launching 3 of the ship's 20-foot whaling boats crewed by 6 men each. Soon enough, 2 of the 3 whaling boats have successfully harpooned whales. No easy feat, since this involves rowing incredibly close to the whale so one man can harpoon it, then holding on for dear life while you try stabbing it to death with a lance. The 3rd boat was not so lucky. It got too close to a whale and was damaged by the powerful beast. As the 2 successful boats are carried away by the panicking whales in what's called a Nantucket sleigh ride, the 3rd crew returns to the ship, where you, as a lowly deckhand, had to stay during the hunt. As the first mate is angrily repairing his boat, you look out and spot the biggest sperm whale you've ever laid eyes on. It's a true monster, probably 85 feet long and weighing 80 tons. The whale is acting strange though. It's floating still in the sea, spraying water from its spout, and seems to be watching you. You shout out as it starts to swim directly toward the boat, traveling at a speed of around 3 knots. The first mate grabs a lance and takes careful aim, but hesitates, worried about angering the beast and it damaging the ship. You pray that it'll dive, but your prayers go unanswered. The giant whale smashes head first into the side of the ship so hard you're knocked off your feet. As water pours in through a hole in the port side and the crew scrambles to get pumps going, you can see that the whale is still there, and it looks enraged, rolling in the water and snapping its jaws. Again, it turns and barrels toward the ship, traveling at 6 knots now as its 12-foot wide tail pumps furiously, leaving a 40-foot wake. The crew frantically tries to maneuver the ship out of the whale's path, but it's too late. The whale once again smashes into the ship head first, this time hitting the ship just below the anchor. The ship gets lodged on the beast's head as the whale pushes the ship sideways through the water and water pours over the transom. Finally, the whale disentangles itself from the wreckage and dives, disappearing for good, but the ship is destroyed. The crew scrambles to lower the last spare whaling boat and fill it with as much food, fresh water, and navigational equipment as possible. When the whaling boats notice that the Essex has disappeared, they immediately cut loose their valuable whales and head back to where they last saw the ship. The first whaling boat to arrive is one led by the captain. As he arrives on the scene to find his majestic ship floundering, the captain turns to the first mate and asks, "My God, Mr. Chase, what's the matter?" Mr. Chase, the first mate, can only reply, "We've been stoved by a whale." You spend that night in the whaling boats tied to the wreckage, but by morning you all know that you need a plan. You're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about as far from land as you can possibly be. You are 20 men and you have only 3 small whaling boats, and you only managed to save 60 days worth of provisions from the wreck. The crew quickly vetoes the captain's plan to head to the Society Islands a few hundred miles away, or to the Marquesas Islands 1,500 miles away, because they had heard rumors of cannibals living on those islands. The irony of this wouldn't be apparent until much later. Instead, it's decided that you'll head south, toward the South American mainland. You figure it'll take about 60 days to reach Chile or Peru, and at least you might be spotted by other whaling ships on the way. Each boat is loaded with 200 pounds of hardtack, a type of dried bread, 65 gallons of water, and 1 gun. Now that you have a plan and are headed towards land, you and the crew are in much higher spirits, believing the worst is behind you, but you have no idea what's in store for you. Within a few short days, those high spirits are broken. The human body needs a half a pint of water per day just to eliminate waste, and you've had less than half that amount. As you chew your hard bread and bemoan your parched throats, it dawns on you. All the food you managed to save has been soaked in seawater, and as the water evaporated, it left behind salt, accelerating your dehydration. To add insult to injury, your boat is attacked again, this time by an aggressive killer whale. Thankfully, you escaped unscathed, but morale is low and getting lower by the minute. After 17 days at sea, a storm hits. Gale-forced winds gust at 45 knots, lightning flashes all around you, and immense 40-foot-high waves toss the boat like toys. But by your 23rd day at sea, you begin to pray for a storm when you find yourself stuck in a dead calm with no wind for days. The captain tries to rally a last-ditch effort and convinces you to row to freedom, but the effort is quickly abandoned as men start to collapse within minutes. You've traveled 1,100 miles, but you're still 5,000 miles from land. You are delirious with thirst, burned raw from the sun, and are rapidly running out of food. You're in an area of the Pacific with no marine life near the surface, so you can't even hope to catch fish. You reach Henderson Island 2 weeks later, but it's barren. Still, 3 men refuse to get back in the boats, and you leave them behind on the island when you resume your mission, assuming that they're dead men. Ironically, they would be rescued 3 months later and would end up being the lucky ones. 1 week later, the first man dies. He was ill before the shipwreck, so it was not unexpected, but it's still a blow to morale. The men tie a rock to his feet and slip the body overboard in traditional sea burial. 2 nights later, the boat led by first mate Chase gets separated from the group. As the 2 remaining boats divide up what's left of the provisions, you realize that there is less than a pound of hardtack left to share between 10 men. A few days later, when the second man dies, you all hesitate about giving him a burial at sea. No one wants to say what you're all thinking. Without food, you will all surely die, and the obvious solution is right there in front of you. You can hardly believe your eyes as you watch one of the most hardened crew members butcher the body of your fellow sailor. First, he separates the limbs from the body, then all the flesh is cut from the bones. The heart is removed, and the body is sewn back up and committed to the sea as decently as possible under the circumstances. Finally, the meat and organs are roasted on a flat stone at the bottom of the boat, and you have the first taste of fresh meat in months. The average human body has about 60 pounds of edible meat, but your starving friend provided less than 30 pounds of very lean meat. Even still, once you've tasted fresh meat again, you can't seem to stop thinking about it. Satisfying your hunger seems to have reawoken it with a vengeance. After 9 weeks adrift in the sea, the men in your boat realize that you would all die without food, and someone suggests you all draw lots to determine who will be eaten next. You know this is an old custom at sea, but you had hoped to never live to see it. The lot falls to young Owen Coffin, and you begin to sweat. Owen is the captain's nephew. Surely he won't let him be eaten. And who better to take his place than you, the youngest and newest member of the crew? To your great relief, young Owen takes his fate heroically. One of his friends kills and butchers him, and you and the others feast again. Over the coming weeks, 3 more men would die and be eaten. After a miserable 89 days at sea, 3 men left clinging to life in first mate Chase's boat spot a sail on the horizon. They muster the last of their energy and chase down an English ship, the Indian, and are finally miraculously rescued. The third boat will be found years later with 3 skeletons inside, among many other scattered bones that show signs of having been gnawed on. But your ordeal is not yet over. You and the captain are the last 2 men left alive and still 1,500 miles from Chile when a ship pulls up alongside your boat. You're so delirious that you don't understand that these people are trying to help you. You're like a starved feral dog, hoarding and protecting the last of the bones of your departed crewmates and trying to suck the marrow from them. As the ship makes its way to shore, you take time to rest and recover. Although you hear that the captain recovered rather quickly and has been dining in style with the captain of the ship and regaling him with stories of your adventure, you're reunited with the other 3 survivors in Valparaiso, and by the end of the summer, nearly 2 years since you left, you're all safely back in Nantucket. You know that cannibalism at sea is customary when men are faced with certain death, but it's still a relief to be welcomed back to your community without judgment. You do hear, though, that the captain wasn't so lucky. His sister can't forgive him for eating his nephew, her son. Despite this harrowing ordeal, within a few years, you and every one of the other 4 survivors will return to sea. And in 1851, a man named Herman Melville will publish a novel inspired by the story of the men of the Essex who were stranded at sea, forced to eat each other. It wasn't very popular at the time, but Moby Dick has gone down in literary history. Sometimes life changes unexpectedly in the blink of an eye. A previously unknown allergic reaction, a lightning strike, a slip and a fall. Freak accidents that forever alter existences. The Robertson family once experienced an extreme version of this. They were over a year into an amazing sailing trip around the world when an unusual calamity suddenly changed their lives forever, forcing them into a life-or-death struggle for survival upon the high seas. The plan to sail around the world began as a whim. In the fall of 1968, the Robertson family parents, Dougal and Lynn, 16-year-old daughter Anne, 17-year-old Douglas, and 9-year-old twins Neil and Sandy were living a hand-to-mouth, hard-scrabble existence running a dairy farm in Staffordshire, UK. One night, Dougal was telling the twins bedtime stories of his stint in the British Merchant Navy when Neil asked if the family could sail around the world. Dougal leapt at the idea. The farm was on the verge of bankruptcy. His kids would get to experience travel and life in other countries in a unique way, so why not? The Robertsons sold Meadow Farm and purchased the Lucette, a 50-year-old 19-ton, 43-foot schooner. On January 21, 1971, the Robertsons set out aboard the Lucette, departing from Falmouth, England. Other than Dougal, none of the family had sailing experience. Immediately, the Robertsons had a trial-by-fire experience. 6 days into their trip, while sailing through the Bay of Biscay off the coast of France, they were caught in a fierce storm with 40-foot waves and 60-mile-per-hour winds. Thankfully, the family survived the storm, learning to sail as they went along. They spent the next 17 months sailing the Caribbean, stopping in ports of call such as Antigua and Barbados. Eventually, Anne met a young man, fell in love, and decided to stay in the Bahamas. The rest of the family sailed on, visiting the Panama Canal. Along the way, the Robertsons took on a 22-year-old Welsh hitchhiker, Robin Williams, as a deckhand. He was going to sail with them all the way to New Zealand. Robin rapidly became an informal part of the family. June 15, 1972 began as a pleasant, typical morning on board the Lucette. The Robertsons were sailing about 200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands. They were 2 days into a 40-day trip to the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia. Boom! Just before 10 a.m., something slammed into the hull of the Lucette with the force of a torpedo. The boat shuddered, lifting into the air. In rapid succession, 2 more hits battered the boat. There was a thunderous cracking sound as the hull split. 3 orcas had rammed the boat. The unusual frenzied attack was over as quickly as it had started, the killer whales vanishing back into the depths of the ocean. But the blows had dealt the Lucette a fatal structural problem. She was sinking, and fast. Pandemonium ensued as the family scrambled to launch an inflatable emergency raft in a small dinghy. There was no time to radio for help. Lynn was still in her nightgown when they abandoned ship. Though Lynn and Douglas had close calls, thankfully everyone safely made it aboard the emergency raft. Within about a minute, the Lucette was gone. The Robertsons were left dazed and disbelieving of the sudden turn life had taken. Floating around them in the water was flotsam from the Lucette. Drifting nearby, tethered to the raft, was their 10-foot dinghy, which they had christened Ednamere. Ednamere was half filled with water and riding low in the ocean. The inflatable raft they were sitting on wasn't much better. During deployment, it had somehow accidentally been punctured. Dougal took charge and the family began rescuing whatever they could from the water, mainly Lynn's sewing basket, which turned out to have needles, both knitting and thread, some razors, a ball of strong yarn, a ballpoint pen, etc. The family also had inventoried their supplies. In the emergency kit for the raft, they had vitamin-fortified bread and glucose, enough for 10 men for 2 days, 18 pints of water, 8 flares, a signal mirror, a bailer, a first aid kit, 3 paddles, and assorted fishing gear. In their mad dash to abandon ship, they'd grabbed a bag of a dozen onions, a tin of biscuits, 10 oranges, 6 lemons, and a bag of candy. They also had some large snails and some sailing gear. Things were looking grim for the family. They were caught in a strong current. It was nearly impossible to row the 200 miles back to the Galapagos Islands. They were over 1,000 miles northeast of the coast of South America and over 2,000 miles west of their original destination of the Marquesas Islands. They weren't adrift near any shipping lanes, so their chances of being sighted and rescued were slim. Even with extreme rationing, their water wouldn't last long. Worse yet, no one knew that their boat had sank and that they were lost at sea. Rather than sailing toward land, Dougal and Douglas came up with the idea of sailing north 400 miles to an area of the ocean where the northern and southern trade winds collide, called the doldrums. The doldrums are known for their calm water and mild surface winds. It also frequently rained there. The Robertsons would have fresh water. After the doldrums, they would assess where to go next, but would probably try to sail toward America. This route would take them through the shipping lanes that go to Australia and New Zealand from America, increasing their chances of rescue. The next 7 days were difficult. The Robertsons bailed out the Ednamere. They reorganized their supplies to maximize space, storing them in the smaller dinghy, which they firmly tethered to the raft. Dougal assigned a watch schedule and sleeping positions for everyone. He tried as best he could to sketch out on a scrap paper the direction they should sail in. The family battled seasickness. The dip and sway of the tiny raft was much different than sailing in a boat. Lynn often recited the Lord's Prayer and sang hymns. She devised a set of stretching exercises for everyone to do to help create a routine and maintain their muscles. Just in case, they cut part of a sail and wrote goodbye letters ahead of time while they were still lucid. Lynn and the twins wrote letters for Anne, while Robin wrote one for his mother. The letters were put into waterproof wrapping and tucked into a pocket of the raft. The castaways carefully rationed the food and, after some missteps, figured out how to catch fish to supplement their meager supplies. They drank spinal cord fluid and sucked on fish eyes to slake their thirst. They also dried strips of fish for later. Unfortunately, catching and cleaning fish attracted 9-foot sharks to circle the raft. Day by day, the leak on the raft kept growing, though they kept trying to patch it. Their mouths grew sore from taking turns blowing up the raft to replace lost air. They were wet and cold all the time, as there was always water in the bottom of the raft. Only the thwart seat stayed dry, and they would take hour-long turns sitting on it. Lynn would often give up her turn for her younger sons. Their sunburned skin became encrusted with salt and broke out in painful boils. On day 7, the Robertsons spotted a ship in the distance. They used up all 3 of their rocket flares trying to signal the boat. They became extremely disheartened that the ship didn't see them and sailed on. Eventually, they reached the doldrums. Dougal fashioned a spear and managed to catch a sea turtle. In addition to eating the turtle, they drank its blood. It had rained briefly once or twice since they were shipwrecked, not enough to collect a supply of drinking water, but the bottom of the Edna Mare had collected a few inches of brackish water mixed with bits of offal and turtle blood. The liquid wasn't safe to drink, but worried about the lack of bowel movements, Lynn, who had training as a nurse, administered enemas to her family using rubber tubes stripped from the rungs of the raft ladder. When taken rectally, the liquid was less poisonous. It wouldn't travel through the digestive system. Robin declined the treatment. Over the next several days, Lynn would periodically administer more enemas, eventually switching to turtle oil rather than water. Finally, 16 days after the shipwreck, it rained. And then it rained some more, all night in fact. After the initial joyous relief of getting fresh water, there was a new problem: too much water. The Robertsons took turns bailing out the raft in the Edna Mare. Finally, on the 17th day, they had to abandon the raft. Patching and bailing couldn't keep it afloat any longer. The castaways moved to the Edna Mare, having carefully thought out which items from the raft they could take with them into the cramped space. The Robertsons put up a sail and steered northeast, taking turns rowing when there was no wind. The rain caused mold to grow on the strips of dried fish and turtle meat they had carefully been preserving. They gorged on what they could and discarded the rest. The rain continued on and off the next few days. More than once, they thought they spotted something in the distance, and a few times even used a precious flare or torch to try and attract attention. Since the wreck of the Lucette, there had been many arguments and tense standoffs between the castaways. Dougal especially had an explosive temper. On day 23, the Robertsons got caught in a storm that lasted most of the afternoon and late into the night. There was thunder and lightning with torrential rain. Even worse, the Edna Mare was in severe danger of being swamped by waves. Everyone was exhausted from bailing. At one point, Robin had to rub feeling back into Dougal's dead tired, ice-cold arms. After hours of battling the storm, Douglas thought that his dad was ready to give up. But then his mom looked at his dad and held his eyes. Then his dad said, "Bail for your lives and bail twice as quick as you're doing now." Reinvigorated, they did. They also sang songs to help stay awake and stay warm. Somehow, they made it until dawn when the storm began to quiet. Every day was a new lesson in misery. By now, the castaways' clothes were rotting off their bodies. It hurt to sit in a single position for very long. There was little padding on their bones. Also, their tender, boil-infested skin would break open, sting from the salt, and weep pus. Their hands and arms were crisscrossed with cuts and scratches from catching sea turtles, which had razor-sharp claws. The Robertsons' lowest point came when they lost their water reserves. They had a couple of tanks of water which were tied together and hung off the side of the boat. While trying to catch an angry sea turtle, the creature slashed the rope with its claws, and the water tanks floated away before the Robertsons could rescue them. They were left trying to save rainwater in a plastic bag and small cups. On July 23, 1972, their 38th day adrift, at twilight the Robertsons spotted a Japanese fishing trawler, the Tokumaru II. Dougal lit a flare, waved it like a madman, and tossed it high into the air when it burned his hands. He was frantically trying to light another flare when the ship turned toward the raft. They had been spotted. The Robertsons were extremely dehydrated, their mouths so dry and their tongues so swollen with thirst they could hardly talk. The fishermen didn't speak much English anyway, and the castaways no Japanese. However, the two groups were able to communicate through hand signals. The Robertsons convinced the fishermen to save their stinky, battered dinghy when they would have abandoned the Edna Mare at sea. The Tokumaru II took the castaways to Panama, where the British embassy put them up in a hotel and gave them medical care. Slowly, they made full recoveries. 10 days after being rescued, Robin flew home to England. The Robertson family returned to their home country at a more leisurely pace, sailing home via ship, although this time a large one, the MV Port Auckland. Dougal and Lynn's marriage disintegrated, haunted by the arguments they had while shipwrecked. Lynn went back to farming. Dougal returned to sailing and wrote a book about his family's survival experience. Many years later, Douglas also wrote a book, weaving in and expanding on portions of his father's book. A mysterious African man, most likely hailing from Mozambique, arrived on Japanese shores in 1579, serving as the bodyguard of an Italian Jesuit named Alessandro Valignano. The young but influential missionary was determined to deliver Christianity across the Far East on the orders of the Catholic Church. As the Jesuit and his bodyguard walked through the streets of many Japanese ports, crowds would gather to stare at the unusual pair of foreigners. Valignano's great height clearly distinguished him from the local population, but not nearly as much as the dark-skinned man in high-class Portuguese clothes who stood by his side. This man, who would become known as Yasuke, was one of the first black men that the people of Japan had ever seen. Unbeknownst to him, his time in Japan would see him through the adventure of a lifetime in the service of a powerful military commander. Yasuke's unlikely exploits would wind up placing him in the history books as the one and only black samurai, the first foreigner to ever be granted the title. But where did Yasuke truly come from? And how did he come to be in the service of Alessandro Valignano? Much of his early life is shrouded in mystery, and his exact age upon arrival in Japan is unknown, though he was by all accounts in his prime. The prevailing historical narrative is that Yasuke was taken from his home during the slave trade and brought to India. From there, the Jesuits may have purchased him as any other slave, but Thomas Lockley, the author of a research paper on the life of Yasuke, as well as a companion biography, challenges the claim that Yasuke was still enslaved by the time he reached Japan. Lockley asserts that Yasuke may have earned his freedom as an indentured mercenary on the Indian subcontinent and found his way into the Jesuits' employ from there. While this claim is somewhat contentious among historians, we should also acknowledge that Alessandro Valignano was no mere parish priest. He was a leading strategist in the Jesuits' sacred mission. Bearing the appointed title of visitor, Valignano had jurisdiction over most of the missions throughout Asia and had his sights set on Japan in particular. If it were true that Yasuke served the visitor while still in bondage to him, he would still have been a valuable asset to the Jesuits, and this is evidenced by the fact that he was taught some of the Japanese language before being brought into the country. Given the discriminatory attitudes of most Europeans toward Africans at the time, any and all privileges that Yasuke might have obtained in Valignano's service were likely bestowed upon him due to a combination of his own loyalty and strength as a bodyguard. Priests like Valignano did not generally surround themselves with soldiers, but this was more of a matter of keeping up a peaceful appearance. In truth, valets such as Yasuke were often skilled with weapons and more than capable of holding their own in defense of their pacifist-leaning Christian employers. This job description does support the idea that Yasuke had a warrior's background, well before he had any involvement with the war between Japan's feudal lords, and his attested feats were certainly impressive. An excerpt from the Shinko Koki describes the Black Monk as being well-built and having the strength of over 10 men. While the details of their personal relationship are unknown, Valignano obviously thought Yasuke to be a sufficient protector for his trip to the capital of Japan in March 1581. But before we can get into the fateful meeting that changed the course of Yasuke's life, it's essential to explore the state of foreign relations in Japan during the Sengoku era. Before Japan's long period of isolation, the island nation openly traded with nations as far away as Europe. This period was known as the Nanban trade. Nanban being the word that the native Japanese used to describe certain groups of foreigners hailing from the southern regions of Asia. New trade routes were established to Portugal, with merchants and missionaries bringing all manner of Western wonders into the market. The legendary warlord Oda Nobunaga had an affinity for foreign curiosities, especially those that could be useful to him in his war to unify all the warring states of Japan. His adoption of matchlock firearms in 1549 had already begun to revolutionize the way battles were fought across Japan. While most military leaders in Japan saw these weapons brought by the Portuguese as unreliable due to slow reload times, Nobunaga circumvented those downsides by mass-producing the guns so his soldiers could carry multiple and replace them after every shot. His novel tactics turned these muskets from borderline useless to being able to produce continuous fire in actual warfare. Nobunaga had done what no commander in Japan had done before, and may have even been one of the first men in the world to make use of firearms in such an efficient manner. This was especially true as Japanese metalworking techniques made the guns forged in his country more consistent and powerful than those in Europe at the time. In 1581, this brilliant military mind was headed to the capital area of Japan at the same time as the Jesuit visitor Alessandro Valignano and his African bodyguard Yasuke. Somehow, fate had conspired to bring the most ambitious warlord of the Sengoku period and the first black man in Japan together in a close encounter that would make history. By the time Nobunaga arrived in the capital, the streets were already bustling with activity, and enormous crowds were being drawn in by some never-before-seen spectacle. The source of this commotion was none other than Yasuke, whose powerful build and skin tone had captured the attention of the Japanese. The people had never seen a man who looked quite like him, and rumors spread quickly throughout the capital. The sheer numbers that Yasuke drew in were enough to cause riots as members of the crowd trampled over each other just to get a glimpse of the new mythical man. It's been alleged in some historical accounts that buildings may have even collapsed under the weight of the number of people who had gathered in the capital to see him. There was more at play here than the mere spirit of inquiry, and in a translated letter from one of the Jesuits, Louis Frois, the attitude of the Japanese toward Yasuke was described as admiration. Perhaps Yasuke had garnered this admiration by showing off his stunning strength, as that same Jesuit letter stated the man knew some performance tricks. These might have been displays of combat skill, or more akin to those of a circus strongman, but either way, Yasuke was quickly seen as a renowned performer, and his physical fitness would impress even Oda Nobunaga. The warlord learned of Yasuke soon after the riot in the capital and immediately asked the Jesuits if he could meet the man. At the time, Yasuke had hidden himself away in a building belonging to the Jesuits after a crowd of his newly won-over fans overwhelmed him, and he had to flee on horseback. Upon the request of Lord Nobunaga, the Jesuits brought Yasuke to meet with him at the Honnoji Temple. Nobunaga was a curious man, and after hearing about the sensation of Yasuke's arrival, he had to know who this foreigner was. When he first laid eyes on Yasuke, Nobunaga was dumbfounded. He couldn't believe that the African man's skin color was a natural part of Yasuke's appearance, and even suggested that he might have been covered in black ink. Nobunaga's enthusiasm for new things got the better of him, and he ordered Yasuke to remove all of his clothes from his upper body. Yasuke complied, removing his outer layers and exposing more of his skin to Nobunaga and his court. The Japanese warlord's fascination with the black foreigner only grew, and he reportedly had Yasuke scrubbed all over with soap and water to verify that his complexion was natural. Once Nobunaga was satisfied with enough empirical evidence, his expression became joyful and even celebratory. The accounts of everyone present, from the Jesuits to Nobunaga's own sons, tell that the powerful man was truly surprised and impressed by Yasuke. And he wasn't the only one, as there was a deeper cultural reason as to why Yasuke's skin color would have been seen as favorable. The same charcoal black color was a color often associated with Buddhist statues, and Buddhism was by far one of the most popular religions in Japan. To witness a man with skin color of a Buddha, who towered over average people and was strong beyond belief, must have been an almost religious experience for the Japanese people. While Oda Nobunaga himself was remembered as something of an atheist, repeatedly breaking taboos of the Buddhist faith, such as violently invading temples in order to gain ground, he was also known to pray for victory at shrines in accordance with the teachings of Nichiren Buddhism. It's possible that Nobunaga, like many of his subjects, saw Yasuke's skin as a sign of divine blessing, but knowing his more pragmatic outlook makes this interpretation largely guesswork. What is known is that a nephew of Nobunaga was so impressed with Yasuke upon this first meeting that he gave him 10,000 Japanese coins. This momentous exchange of currency marked Yasuke's first taste of true freedom in Japan. He would come to visit Nobunaga once again in the province of Ichizen while still in the company of the Jesuits. Because he was able to speak a decent amount of Japanese, Yasuke was able to converse with Nobunaga, and the two appeared to strike up a friendship almost immediately. He would leave the service of Alessandro Valignano as the missionary moved on to other lands and become a vassal of Nobunaga's realm. It was around this time that the African man acquired the name Yasuke, a Japanese-sounding name, which, depending on the source, was either a corruption of the Makua name Yasufe or a portmanteau of Yao and the common Japanese male suffix suke, meaning he was a member of the Yao people. With his new Japanese name, Yasuke was also given a private residence as well as a ceremonial katana by Nobunaga. But this show of hospitality was far from the end of Nobunaga's ambitions for the man. There was much talk throughout the region that Yasuke might soon be given the title of Lord. Given Nobunaga's knack for bringing out the potential of his followers, this prediction was not far-fetched. From the start of his illustrious military career, Oda Nobunaga had always had a sharp eye for identifying the most promising warriors of his regiments. For example, of all the Ashigaru infantrymen at his disposal, Nobunaga had chosen a peasant foot soldier named Toyotomi Hideyoshi to become his personal sandal-bearer. The same Hideyoshi would prove to have such a talent for fighting and strategy that after the Battle of Okeazama, Nobunaga would appoint him as one of his most trusted retainers. Following Nobunaga's death, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would go on to complete his former lord's mission to unify all of Japan under one banner. There's a lot to be said about Hideyoshi's rise from peasant with no samurai background to the Supreme Chancellor of Japan. But for the purpose of this video, it's just an example of how Oda Nobunaga would elevate everyone he took a special interest in. Yasuke's unique appearance might have been what caught Nobunaga's eye to begin with, but it was the man's proficiency with weapons and his liveliness as a conversation partner that kept his lord's attention. In time, and in much the same way that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was appointed Nobunaga's sandal-bearer, Yasuke was made to be Nobunaga's weapon-bearer. The sudden promotion made Yasuke a high-ranking retainer of Nobunaga's court and effectively a samurai. Yasuke was later given retainers of his own by Nobunaga, as was customary for any man of status at the time. But the true mettle of a samurai is decided on the battlefield. And when Oda Nobunaga made his push to defeat the Takeda clan, Yasuke marched off to war with his forces. Yasuke fought beside Nobunaga in this lengthy campaign against Takeda Katsuyori, which culminated in Nobunaga's decisive victory in the bloody Battle of Tenmokuzan. As the Black Samurai traveled through the former Takeda lands with his leader, he came to meet the famous Tokugawa Ieyasu. Alongside Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Ieyasu is considered one of the three unifiers of Japan and would go on to become its first shogun in due time. For now, he, like Yasuke, was a vassal of the Oda clan, albeit one who quite literally made a name for himself when he founded the Tokugawa clan. Matsudaira Aitada, a retainer of Ieyasu's, records the meeting between his lord and Yasuke in his journal, mentioning Yasuke by name. This same journal entry also lists an exact height for Yasuke. He was 6 feet and 2 inches tall and must have dwarfed the average Japanese person. His impressive stature, coupled with his known ability to perform feats of strength, made it almost expected that he would participate in one of Japan's oldest sporting competitions, sumo. In a museum in Osaka, there exists a historic Japanese wind wall, or byobu, with an illustration that features a sumo match between a Japanese wrestler and his opponent who has noticeably much darker skin. For this and other reasons we'll discuss, the black sumo wrestler is generally believed to be an artistic depiction of Yasuke. In the drawing, his sumo match is happening in the presence of a distinguished samurai lord who bears a slight resemblance to Oda Nobunaga. Being an enjoyer of sumo was another of Nobunaga's well-known characteristics, and from 1570 to 1581, the warlord threw grand tournaments where any man could put his wrestling skills to the test. The time frame within which these sumo tournaments took place does overlap with the start of Yasuke's service to Nobunaga. Given how highly the lord thought of the Black Samurai's physical strength, it makes sense that Yasuke would have been allowed and encouraged to take part in the ongoing matches. The drawing itself was done in 1605, many years after Nobunaga's death, but it's heartening to think that Yasuke and Nobunaga would be the subject of such an art piece long after the time they spent together. There was more to their friendship than sumo, as Nobunaga invited the Black Samurai to dine with him on at least one occasion. This was a great honor that feudal lords of Japan offered to only a select few of their vassals. Oda Nobunaga was no exception in regards to the exclusivity of his dinner invitations. The notion that he trusted Yasuke so completely as to have dinner with him was an indication that their bond had only grown closer since their first meeting. It's likely that Nobunaga learned many extraordinary facts about the world outside of Japan in his conversations with Yasuke. The warlord never crossed the seas to visit other countries in his lifetime, but perhaps through the eyes of his well-traveled African retainer, he was able to vicariously imagine more of the curious sights that could have awaited him. These talks must have been equally awe-inspiring from Yasuke's perspective, as the luxury and power afforded to the samurai was far beyond anything he might have known in his service of the Jesuits. Had Yasuke's service to Nobunaga lasted longer, the Black Samurai might have been granted further privileges befitting of his noble titles, like Ieyasu and Hideyoshi before him. But in 1582, his chance to rise through the ranks of the samurai and become a true lord were crushed, along with Nobunaga's own dream to unify Japan. In June of that year, Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's generals and another bodyguard turned samurai, betrayed the trust of his lord and moved 13,000 Oda clan troops on Honnoji Temple, where Nobunaga lay completely vulnerable. This turnabout was so sudden that even the soldiers in Mitsuhide's command likely didn't know the full truth of whose army they were fighting. Tokugawa Ieyasu, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and the rest of Nobunaga's generals were busy fighting battles on other fronts during this attack. Nobunaga had almost no forces to bring to bear against the traitor Mitsuhide. There were only about 150 trained men at his disposal, including Yasuke. It's said that Nobunaga's loyal attendant, Mori Ranmaru, took up a bow and arrow in the battle alongside his brothers, despite having never been a warrior. The young men did not survive the day, and Honnoji burned as Nobunaga and his remaining soldiers fought to their dying breaths. Akechi's much larger army took the temple easily, despite its fortifications, and Nobunaga was grievously wounded with a spear that was thrown by the enemy troops. He reportedly told the court ladies and other non-combatants to flee to safety before enclosing himself in the back room of the palace. There, with Yasuke by his side, Nobunaga committed seppuku in the ritual fashion of the samurai. Because Yasuke was Nobunaga's personal weapon bearer, and was present for these fleeting moments, it's speculated the Black Samurai might have served as a Kaisha Kunin, a trusted second person who delivers the killing blow during seppuku. Whatever the truth of the matter was, Yasuke fled the temple following the death of his lord. After the battle, Akechi Mitsuhide sought to confirm his victory over Nobunaga, and he searched the burnt-out ruins of Honnoji for his enemy's head. Much to his frustration, Mitsuhide did not find it, and it's alleged by some historians that Yasuke carried it with him later that day when he went to join up with the army of Oda Nobutada, Nobunaga's son. Nobutada learned of Mitsuhide's betrayal and his father's death, and was advised by one of the other samurai, Murai Sadakatsu, to make his way to the Nijo Castle in Kyoto. There, Nobutada gathered all of the available forces that were still loyal to Nobunaga's cause. Yasuke made his way to Nijo Castle as well and was present for Nobutada's war council. All non-combatants were sent elsewhere until only the samurai remained in the fortified castle. Akechi Mitsuhide still had the overwhelming advantage in numbers and mobility, and because he was aware of this, Nobutada chose to bunker down within Nijo Castle and command his forces to hold it as long as they could. Another letter from Louis Frois states that Yasuke fought and defended the castle but was captured later in the day and forced to surrender his sword. Facing inevitable defeat, Oda Nobutada committed seppuku as well, instructing his own Kaisha Kunin, Kamata Shinsuke, to hide his remains so that Mitsuhide would not find them. Most of the vassals gathered at Nijo Castle were killed, including Murai Sadakatsu, and others were forced to commit seppuku, but Yasuke was spared this fate by Akechi Mitsuhide. This apparently was not a gesture of kindness on the part of Mitsuhide, who supposedly made racist statements about Yasuke, saying that he was not Japanese and therefore nothing more than an animal. Following the Battle of Nijo Castle, Yasuke was escorted back to the Nanban Temple, where the Jesuits recognized him and took him in. Louis Frois said the Jesuits were quite relieved to see Yasuke alive and well after all this time. Any further information about his life beyond this point is extremely scarce, and no further Jesuit letters mention him. Because of the death of Oda Nobunaga and the actions of Akechi Mitsuhide, Yasuke had for all intents and purposes been stripped of his rank as samurai. For all we know, he might have continued to live freely in Japan or purchased a ride on a boat and returned to his homeland. It's most likely he faded into the background of history, but one account of the Battle of Yamazaki tells a different, more glorious story. The Battle of Yamazaki took place only 13 days after the betrayal and slaughter of Honnonji and was set in motion as soon as Toyotomi Hideyoshi intercepted a letter from Akechi Mitsuhide's forces that revealed the traitor's plans to send his forces after Hideyoshi next. The peasant-born samurai lord Toyotomi Hideyoshi led the forces of the Oda clan against Mitsuhide, and over the course of his decisive battle was able to avenge Nobunaga and secure his position as his former lord's successor. A great many of Nobunaga's former allies participated in this fight to defeat Akechi Mitsuhide, and it's even said that manning one of the cannons for the Oda clan on that side of the battle was a man with a, quote, coal complexion. This man might have been the Black Samurai who, out of loyalty to his fallen lord, left the Jesuits and sought out the banner of Hideyoshi, another of Nobunaga's long shots, in order to provide his prowess in battle against the traitorous enemy that had struck down his friend and leader. Because there are no mentions of Yasuke's name in any record of the battle, there has been no way for historians to confirm if this particular Oda gunner was really Yasuke. Sources do indicate that other foreigners served in Japan's civil wars during and after the reign of the Oda clan, but Yasuke was the first and only one to be granted his right to a sword by one of the premier warlords of the time. Regardless of whether Yasuke was present at the Battle of Yamazaki, his legacy and close bond with Nobunaga left an indelible mark on world history, and will forever be known as the only Black Samurai. We all have minor accidents in wintry weather, like slipping and falling on ice. It's usually annoying, but it's nothing compared to narrowly escaping a deadly avalanche, just to be thrown off a cliff by a second one a few hours later. That's the unbelievably true story of Ken Jones, a British hiker who was hiking in the Transylvanian Alps and had to deal with one of Mother Nature's fastest, deadliest disasters, twice. Jones's solo climbing trip turned into a nightmare most people can't even imagine. Freezing in the mountain cold, buried under snow with broken bones, and worst of all, entirely alone. Jones found himself facing incredibly unfavorable odds for survival. So what did he do? Ken Jones was a 26-year-old student at Manchester University majoring in political science. He had an adventurous nature, perhaps arising from his time spent in the UK military. When he decided to venture out to Romania and hike Mount Moldavanu in Transylvania's Carpathian Mountains on his own, it wasn't an unusual feat for him. At 8,200 feet high, Mount Moldavanu is the highest peak in Romania. Jones arrived in Romania around New Year's Day and started the climb one cold morning in January of 2003. Though Moldovanu Peak has hiking trails full of climbers during the summer, in the winter it's mostly deserted due to the deep snow, cold, and generally harsh conditions. However, since Jones was missing his army days, he wanted to undertake this solitary hiking challenge to recapture that sense of adventure. He figured his experience of 4 years as a paratrooper and 2 years as a Special Forces soldier would help support him during his climb. The first few hours on the mountain went smoothly. Jones climbed up higher and higher at a good pace until a change in the weather, decrease in visibility, and a layer of deeper snow high up on the mountain slowed him down. As he was nearing the summit, a heavy snowfall started and the sky became opaque. Jones decided conditions were too poor to continue, so he would go back down and attempt the summit the next day. A slight tremor he had felt in the ground below him, combined with an unusual noise, increased his unease and further urged him to climb back down. As Jones was now descending a few minutes later, he heard the same strange noise again, but louder this time. Now, it was unmistakable, a noise Jones was familiar with thanks to military training in mountains and wintry conditions. It was the sound of recent snowfall stressing the solid snowpack underneath, creating dangerous conditions. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. The sound rang out a third time, very close to his position. This time, it sounded like the entire mountain was creaking under its weight. Fearful of what he suspected was about to happen, Jones dropped down on the ground and tobogganed down the mountain on his back. As he neared the forest, he stood up to find cover and heard what he had feared the most: the loud crack that signals the start of an avalanche, like a whip crack magnified by 100. With few good paths of escape, Jones ran through the forest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He hoped a large clump of trees would divert the snow and protect him from the worst of the incoming avalanche. Refusing to look back, Jones could hear the quickening speed of the mass of snow hurtling toward him. It sounded like an entire airport full of planes taking off at once, combined with the constant machine gun-like snapping of tree branches being broken off in the avalanche's path. The air filled with snow shooting in all directions. The powder on the ground shot up, clouding Jones's vision, and he knew he was in the thick of it. Suddenly, the ear-piercing rumble of the snow continued down the hill in front of him. Miraculously, Jones was standing firmly against a tree for protection, still alive, well, and most definitely not buried under a Transylvanian avalanche. The brunt of the avalanche had missed him, and the trees had provided adequate protection from the full force of the disaster. Since avalanches have been known to tear out entire swaths of forest from their roots and even demolish entire towns, Jones's survival in the forest was far from guaranteed. His escape was nothing short of extraordinary. An immense wave of relief swept over him. He had narrowly avoided what could have been a deadly disaster. Jones resumed his climb down the mountain, looking forward to a night in his sleeping bag and an early summit tomorrow. A few minutes later, Jones stopped again. What he was hearing couldn't possibly be happening. But horrifyingly, there it was, a large crack echoing around the slopes, and the same Boeing engine-like rumble starting to come down the mountain. Let's leave Jones in his truly unenviable position for a moment to look at what causes avalanches and exactly how enormous they can be. Avalanches can be caused by changing weather conditions, such as a recent storm or snowfall stressing a snowpack on a slope, or by human triggers such as snowmobiles, skiers, and explosives that destabilize the snowpack. When an avalanche picks up speed, it can reach 80 to 100 miles per hour while booming down a slope, too fast for even the fastest animal in the world, a cheetah, that tops out at 75 miles per hour to outrun. Though we don't know the exact size of the avalanche hurtling towards Jones, it's safe to say that it was a medium to large size avalanche from his description of the snow. Medium avalanches can range from 165 to 655 feet and have a volume of up to 220,000 gallons. Large avalanches can range up to 2,000 to 3,000 feet and have a volume of up to 2.2 million gallons, or about the size of 4 full-size Olympic swimming pools of snow. Being buried under that would almost certainly be fatal. Now back to Jones, who was having the worst case of deja vu imaginable. Completely exposed this time, Jones ran down the hill knowing the avalanche was moving too fast for him to escape. The snow caught up with him, whiting out everything around him once again. This time, he wouldn't be as lucky as before. The avalanche picked him up off his feet and rolled him uncontrollably down the slope. Suddenly, Jones could no longer feel the ground. The avalanche had thrown him straight off a cliff, and Jones plunged around 75 feet or around 7.5 stories to the valley below. The avalanche rolled him further down until it smashed him against some trees and rocks. To understand the horrible predicament Jones was in, the general survival rate for avalanche victims depends a lot on the time of rescue. If an avalanche victim is found within the first 18 minutes, the chance of them surviving are more than 91%. So far, so good, right? These odds don't sound too bad. Here's the problem. If the victim is removed from under the avalanche within 19 to 35 minutes, the chances of them surviving plummet to 34%. After 35 minutes trapped in freezing snow without rescue, the picture starts to look really bleak really fast. Jones was alone. No one knew his exact location or that anything had happened to him. He had no method of communication. Worst of all, he would quickly realize that his leg was broken at the femur and his pelvis was shattered. The nearest town was 10 miles away. At this point, let's just say his odds of survival that day were about the same as him winning the lottery. When he regained consciousness, Jones tried to stand. His left leg immediately gave way under him, and indescribable pain shot through his entire body. Jones knew he now only had 3 limbs to work with and few supplies. His sleeping bag, poncho, rations, dry kit, first aid kit, and flask were gone. He was left with a Leatherman tool, a compass, 2 bags of crumpled up food, sausage rolls and cakes, and a length of parachute cord, a light nylon rope used as a general utility cord. He got one small stroke of luck. Looking around the darkness, he was relieved to see the glow from his head torch uphill. Painfully and slowly, he dragged his body up the slope to retrieve it, finding his hat along the way. As he descended again, he located his canoe sack, a bag for keeping items dry, with a pair of dry socks and a plastic liter-sized water bottle within it. By now, it was nighttime. Feeling his feet were dangerously swollen, Jones removed his boots and placed his legs inside of the canoe sack for protection against the cold. Retreating his arms and head into his upper layers like a tortoise so they could be protected, he fought sleep off almost the whole night, knowing that giving in could cause him to enter a hypothermic state. At the first light of dawn, Jones started making his way down the mountain. He knew there was a stream down in the valley, and if he reached it, he could fill his water bottle and follow the stream back to civilization. Jones crawled from dawn until dusk, repeating the military commands and sayings he remembered from his training days to keep him motivated when he felt weak. Though he crawled all day, his progress was slow, and he realized that he'd have to spend a second night out in the cold, exposed and alone. During the night, thoughts of his faraway friends and family flashed through his head. He thought of their comfort and ignorance of his predicament and wondered if he would see them again. Miraculously, he made it through another freezing wintry night outdoors. The second day, after more hours of painful crawling on 3 limbs, which was tearing up his hands and body, Jones reached the stream. He drank and refilled his water bottle, then continued crawling along the banks of the stream toward the nearest vehicle track he could remember encountering on his way to the mountain. Several times he found his way completely blocked. Each time, he had to strip off his upper layers, throw them across the stream to keep dry, and either hop or swim his way across the freezing water. Then he would crawl further down and find his new path blocked by cliffs, forcing him to repeat this excruciating and freezing process. The third night, Jones was sure was his last. The symptoms of hypothermia, confusion, drowsiness, shallow breathing, a weak pulse, and fumbling hands had completely set in, and he had lost all feeling in his right foot. A heavy snowfall had also started during the night. Though it seemed like bad luck at the time, it may have actually saved Jones's life. He awoke in a cocoon of snow which had helped keep his body temperature a few degrees warmer at night than it would have been, like an igloo. To this day, he believes this prevented him from completely succumbing to hypothermia that night. As Jones continued his descent the next day, the route bottlenecked, meaning Jones had to get into the freezing cold water one last time. Hungry, exhausted, shivering, and feeling utterly defeated, he swam on for what seemed like ages, but again reached an impasse. By that point, he had been in the water for almost 3 hours and covered just under 330 feet thanks to his dead leg and weakened condition. He knew that if he spent much more time wet and cold, he would be dead. Jones managed to slowly and painfully climb out of the water, but in the process lost his right boot. As Jones continued his descent, he started hallucinating, convinced he was seeing food, specifically an iced pink Victoria sandwich, a specialty of his mother's. As the hallucinations intensified and started to include cartoons from his childhood and other sightings, Jones decided to keep his head down, looking straight at the ground in hopes the hallucinations would go away. Finally, he looked up and breathed a sigh of relief. He had reached the vehicle track, but there was still a lot more ground he needed to cover. Jones found a sturdy stick and used it as a makeshift crutch to cover more ground. With a renewed enthusiasm now that he had reached signs of human life, he was still a few miles away from the town of Fagarash, and certainly some distance away from reaching the first person on the outskirts of the village. After about 1.9 miles, Jones glanced up and saw a house. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. For 4 days and 3 nights, he'd crawled down the frozen mountain in a desperate search for help without encountering a single human being. Even a sighting of Dracula's castle would have been welcome. Suddenly, there was an actual house and a man inside the house watching TV. He knocked on the door, realizing his mangled appearance might scare the house's occupants. An old man answered, with a younger, larger man not far behind him. Though at first they were apprehensive, once they realized Jones's weakened state, the younger man carried him in and offered him a drink, food, and a change of clothes. The men also fetched a boy from the village named Bogdan, who spoke some English to help translate. At this point, Jones was starting to feel weak. After Bogdan's arrival, on the verge of passing out, he faintly asked for an ambulance. After stopping at 2 smaller regional hospitals that didn't have the equipment to even attempt to treat him, Jones had to ride over 3 hours to a city hospital in Brasov, where he was admitted. However, as many people say, bad luck comes in threes. After surviving 2 avalanches and miraculously making it to a hospital, you would think Jones's ordeal would be over. However, the 26-year-old Brit wasn't in the clear just yet. Jones was hungry, frostbitten, and emaciated. His ordeal had left him quite a bit worse for wear, but he hoped that in the hospital he would make a speedy recovery. Then, in a few days in, something changed. Jones started deteriorating rapidly. The stress of his torturous ordeal had wreaked havoc on his internal organs, and most importantly, his stomach. After several days of unbelievable stress on the mountain, hyperactive acid levels in Jones's stomach had perforated his stomach lining, spilling out acids and other toxins throughout his body. Jones went into shock and doctors thought he would die. He even remembers seeing a member of his medical team apologizing to his mother for not being able to save him right before he blacked out completely. But the ex-military hiker had one more trick up his sleeve. After doctors removed 2/3 of his stomach and his duodenum, not only did he make a full recovery, becoming stable enough to return to the UK after 3 weeks in Romania, after months of intensive physical therapy and the help of a top hip surgeon, the man who doctors said would never walk again got up to walk, almost 2 years later. Today, Jones leads a very active lifestyle, training intensely as a cyclist. His experience of survival on the mountain is still something he carries with him. And Jones said it's opened him up and given him a new perspective. That cold January in Romania, Ken Jones was hit with 2 waves of bad luck in the form of massive, deadly avalanches. However, his incredible survival has become an inspirational story of what people can achieve when faced with the impossible, and a testament to the unbelievable endurance of the human mind and body. March 5, 1944, the Burmese jungle, U.S. Army 849th Engineer Aviation Battalion Camp. "Get back!" yelled 21-year-old Private Herman Perry. He stood in the road brandishing his M1 Grand rifle. Lieutenant Katie ignored the warning and stepped closer. Sweating, sobbing, probably coming off an opium high, Perry was losing it, having a breakdown. He wasn't going to let Katie take him into custody. He wasn't going to do more time at the parasite-infested hellhole known as the Lido Stockade. Despite Perry's erratic behavior, Katie wasn't about to back off. This boy had a smart mouth. He'd been AWOL. He was a troublemaker. He needed to be punished. Besides, there was no way that Perry would shoot. That would be suicidal. Now less than a foot away from Perry, Katie stretched out a hand toward him. Bam! Katie jerked and crumpled to the ground. For a split second, everyone stared in disbelief at the fatally wounded Katie. Then Perry swung his gun around and trained it on the other officers as he backed away down the road. As he neared the trees, he turned and ran, vanishing into the brush. During World War II, the United States segregated its armed forces. Sure, there were a couple of African-American combat units created mainly for political reasons, but the majority of African Americans who served were relegated to menial tasks, including cooking, cleaning, and construction. That's how close to 10,000 African Americans ended up being shipped to Burma. These men are stationed there to build what will end up being a boondoggle, a 1,072-mile supply road to run through the Burmese jungle connecting Lido, India to Kunming, China. Some 5,000 white Americans are also sent to work on the Lido Road. However, many of them are officers overseeing the black soldiers. The Burmese jungle is torturous. It's hot, humid, the vegetation's dense, the terrain is rough, it's easy to get malaria or dysentery, and it's hard to avoid the leeches, lice, and mosquitoes. Even worse, sometimes man-eating tigers lurk in the brush, clothes rot, and the food rations are poor. Building the Lido Road is back-breaking, far harder than Perry's North Carolinian childhood of picking cotton in a sharecropping family. The soldiers have mandatory 16-hour shifts. Bulldozers supplied by the army quickly break down, and the GIs are forced into manual labor. They use hoes and pickaxes to dig the muddy, rocky red soil. Many of the black soldiers work side by side and become friendly with coolies, unskilled native laborers. As a result, the black soldiers pick up bush lingo, Urdu, and Hindi. They trade in the local black markets for moonshine known as jungle juice. Some soldiers, including Perry, seek solace from the grim drudgery of their lives in opium and marijuana. When Katie was attempting to take him into custody, Perry was coming off a 2-day drug bender. After shooting Katie, a panicked Perry runs into the jungle. Oh God, he killed someone! For 3 days, Perry stumbles through the jungle in a daze. Not knowing what to do, he veers back to the Lido Road. He runs into some soldiers from a different unit working on the road. They feed him and pass along messages from his friends in the 849th Battalion. Military police are looking for him. Perry decides to surrender. At nightfall, he stands by a bridge for the Namyung River. Sooner or later, a patrol will come by and he'll turn himself in. While waiting, Perry sits down his rifle. Hearing gunshots somewhere nearby, Perry gets worried the MPs are gunning for him and they'll kill him outright instead of arresting him. Spooked, he slips into the jungle again, accidentally leaving his gun behind. Perry spends several days wandering in the jungle. Luckily, he speaks some bush lingo, which allows him to beg for rice from Naga farmers. The Naga are an ethnic group native to northeastern India and northwestern Burma. Some of the tribes live remotely and stick to traditional practices, including headhunting. For the most part, the British and Americans ignore the Naga as long as they stick to making war on each other and not Westerners. March 18th. Around 2 weeks after he'd killed Katie and fled into the jungle, Perry runs into some British troops. Perry, who's always been a smooth talker, thinks fast and makes up excuses as to why he's alone in the jungle. He's able to charm the Brits into giving him some food rations. It's hard going trekking through the remote Patkai's foothills, but the farther away Perry gets from the army, the better. One day, Perry's hiking up a dense mountain slope when he sees something spine-chilling, a basha, or temporary shelter often made with bamboo. This basha is decorated with human skulls, to which water buffalo horns have been attached. Perry has stumbled into the head-hunting Naga village of Tumga. Believe it or not, Perry delights the villagers by giving them the remaining canned food rations he got from the British. The Ang, or village chief, invites him to be his honored guest. Perry takes a liking to the chief's 14-year-old daughter. She seems to return his interest. Perry has a new problem. How do you flirt with a girl and impress her warrior father when you don't know the culture or speak the language? The answer is gifts. Perry hikes some 8 miles down the mountain back to the Lido Road. Somehow he manages to get a hold of a load of army goods. Most importantly, he gets an M1 Garand. In Naga culture, tiger pelts and claws are prized. The act of killing a tiger is seen as a virile feat of masculinity. Compared to the clubs and flintlocks the Naga have, with his modern gun, Perry is seen as having the ability to kill many a tiger. The village is impressed. Perry is considered an important man, and the chief allows Perry to marry his daughter. The first few months of Perry's married life are pretty good. He struggles with malaria, but due to his stockpile of army rations, he's rich enough to hire servants to work his fields. Perry spends much of his time hunting monkeys and tigers. He grows fluent in his wife's language. The couple's excited to find out that they're expecting their first child. Many nights, the tribal musicians play flutes and drums while the tribe chants, takes psychoactives, and dances. Meanwhile, the army has offered a 1,000 rupee reward for information leading to Perry's capture. That's upwards of $14,500 in today's money. They assume that he's headed for the city, so they've been searching for him in Calcutta. The legend of Perry is beginning to grow. Warranted or not, he's becoming a folk hero. To the black GIs who stew with the resentment of daily petty racial humiliations, Perry is awesome. Apropos of what actually happened, they see Perry as someone who fought back against the man and won. Eventually, Perry becomes homesick. When he was drafted into the army, he left behind a young daughter and a girlfriend in Washington, D.C. Also, his stockpile of rations is quickly dwindling. He begins to hunger for Western items, especially cigarettes. He hires runners to go down the mountain to trade at the black market in rural towns. Finally, the army finds a clue. In the summer, some 5 months after Perry vanished, a coolie finds the rifle Perry accidentally left behind when he panicked at the bridge. The army realizes they've been searching in the wrong place. They put out feelers in rural towns near where the gun was found. Eventually, a rumor reaches their ears about the chief of Tumga having a black soldier as a son-in-law. Army brass is incredulous. They never would have expected an unarmed tenderfoot like Perry to survive for so long in the jungle. A runner who had gone to the town of Namyong to get rice quickly comes back to tell Perry that there are men searching for him. Perry leaves his wife in Tumga and goes to Noksa, or a satellite village. July 20th. Captain Walter McMinn and a small posse of MPs, along with hired Naga guides, go on a 3.5-hour hike up the mountain to Tumga. None of the Americans speak any Naga. They use a picture of Perry and hand signs to communicate. The posse learns that Perry's gone to the Noksa. By the time that the posse huddles outside of the Noksa making a plan, it's twilight. The MPs get a guide to go ask Perry to borrow his gun for a hunt. The ploy works. It's a common request and Perry agrees, which leaves him unarmed. Army snipers sneak through the brush and position themselves around Perry's basha. They have to be careful. It would be diplomatically unwise to accidentally kill any Naga. While eating dinner, Perry sees flickers of light outside. The Naga don't have flashlights. It can only mean Westerners. Perry thinks about trying to sneak into the pitch-black jungle behind the village, but tigers have recently been a problem. He grabs a dao, or short Chinese sword, and lights a bamboo staff to use as a torch. Getting up his nerve, Perry goes outside. McMinn immediately blinds Perry with his flashlight, ordering him not to move. McMinn fires, but misses. Perry takes off, and the soldiers chase him, shooting as they go. Perry seems to vanish into the jungle, escaping the ambush, but then they find his body at the bottom of a hill. Perry's been shot in the chest. Around 10 p.m., McMinn hikes several hours back to Namyong to get a doctor and more soldiers. Even with the extra manpower, it ends up being a 9-hour ordeal to carry the stretcher bearing the 170-pound severely injured Perry down the mountain to reach Lido Road. From there, an ambulance takes Perry to the 73rd Evacuation Hospital at Xingbuyang. Perry spends the next several days recovering. While Perry's hyped up on morphine and other medical drugs, he's frequently interrogated. At first, he denies being Perry, but then finally admits his identity and confesses to shooting Katie. He's coerced into signing a 3-page document that he's told is a statement of what had happened, though Perry thinks some key facts are missing or distorted. Against his better judgment, he notarizes and signs the paperwork. On August 28th, Perry is deemed healthy enough to be transferred to prison. He's sent to the notorious Lido Stockade, the very prison he was trying to evade when he shot Katie in the first place. This is his second stint in the stockade. Several months before the whole shooting incident, Perry had spent hellish months in Lido, convicted for disobeying orders when an officer tried to assign him extra work. Though Perry's sentence for disobedience was 90 days, he'd been forced to serve an extra couple of weeks in the stockade without an explanation. The army assigns Perry a lawyer, Captain Clayton Oberholzer. Unfortunately for Perry, Oberholzer only has experience as a civilian lawyer and has never handled a felony. The fact that Perry killed Katie is indisputable, but Oberholzer hopes to get the charges reduced from premeditated capital murder to manslaughter, the difference being life in prison versus execution if convicted. Perry is also accused of desertion and willful disobedience. September 4th, 1944. Perry's court-martial takes less than 6 hours. Oberholzer fumbles a chance to get the sworn statement Perry made while drugged tossed. He botches explaining that the morning of the murder, a distraught Perry was headed to see Lieutenant Colonel Hyatt, the commander of the camp, who had an open-door policy to chat with the soldiers, white or black. Katie went out of his way to accost Perry with the intent to take him into custody, consciously seeking to prevent him from seeing Hyatt, who might have limited Perry's punishment for going AWOL. When Oberholzer brings up Katie's history of abuse toward black GIs, the tribunal warns him that Katie's character isn't on trial. The vote is unanimous. Perry is dishonorably discharged, must forfeit all pay, and will be hanged by the neck until dead. As part of the Army's due process, the verdict condemning Perry to death must undergo a review by 3 members of the Judge Advocate General's Department in New Delhi. All the way across the world, Perry's mom gets a letter from the Army informing her that her son has been court-martialed, convicted of murder, and is sentenced to hang. Bewildered and frightened, she scraps together some money and hires the best lawyer she can get. Her lawyer submits a brief to the Washington-based office of the Judge Advocate General's Department. The Washington office informs New Delhi that a brief for the Perry case will shortly arrive in the mail. Nearly a month later, on December 15th, the New Delhi office transmits a classified message asking about the brief. It hasn't arrived. It's been lost in the mail. Meanwhile, Perry has been stuck in limbo, imprisoned in Lido Stockade. He spent his time watching and memorizing guard schedules. Then, on December 15th, Perry makes his move. Late at night, he crawls under the rear of his tent. The sleepy soldier standing guard at the entrance to his tent doesn't notice. Perry only has 11 minutes before the next time the guards make a circuit. Using wire cutters he stole while on work detail, he quickly cuts a hole in the prison fence just big enough to wiggle through. Protected by strips of coarse wool cut from his prison-issue blanket, Perry crawls through the drainage ditches filled with barbed wire. After that, he runs through a field at the stockade's edge and disappears into the jungle. Sweet freedom. Perry stops to catch his breath. He's free, but some 80 miles of mountainous jungle separates him from his wife and unborn child. How's he gonna get home? Army brass loses their minds when they realize that Perry has escaped. The Lido Stockade's warden and 8 guards are formally reprimanded for negligence. The army again puts a 1,000 rupee bounty on Perry's head. They radio broadcast Perry's description in several languages and print wanted posters. By airplane, they drop some posters on the village of Tsunami. The illiterate Naga villagers collect them, impressed that pictures of the chief's son-in-law are falling from the heavens. MPs begin stopping black soldiers at random based on the chances that they might be helping Perry. Whenever they can, many black soldiers tear up the wanted posters. They enjoy swapping tales and rumors of the Jungle King. The law brief in defense of Perry finally reaches New Delhi on December 27th. The advocate judge's review finds some of the army's actions questionable, but reconfirms the verdict of execution. In the wee hours of January 1st, 1945, Perry is almost caught at an abandoned timber camp by a posse of MPs who had heard rumors of a black soldier hiding there. Luckily for Perry, he's a light sleeper and escapes into the jungle just in time. A bullet barely grazes him. The MPs recover a .45 pistol Perry accidentally left behind. February 19th. 2 black soldiers, Staff Sergeant Toomer and T4 Troxler, are buying liquor in the town of Macomb when Perry suddenly storms the bootlegger's shack. Somehow he's gotten a replacement .45 pistol. He mugs the 2 soldiers of 95 rupees and forces the bootlegger to cook him dinner. Perry asks Toomer and Troxler to do him a favor. He wants them to bring a truck stocked with rations, clothes, a tent, a knife, and ammunition in the next 24 hours. They agree to meet Perry in Macomb the following night. Even though he stole money from them, Toomer and Troxler debate what to do. Ultimately, they decide to tell the army, mainly out of fear of what could happen to them if the army found out that they had suppressed information about Perry. They inform Major Earl Owen Cullum, commanding officer of the 159th Military Police Battalion at nearby Chauba Camp. Cullum decides to set up a trap. The soldiers will arrive with the truck and the army will ambush Perry. Toomer and Troxler agree to help as long as the army keeps it a secret that they betrayed the Jungle King. However, Perry has anticipated a trap. A crowd of coolies shows up to meet Toomer and Troxler. The army doesn't see Perry, but even if he's there, they can't shoot without risking a diplomatic incident. Suddenly, from among the crowd, Perry sprints for the truck and hops aboard. He forces Toomer and Troxler to drive away down the road, but there's a snag. A checkpoint's coming up. Perry gets out of the truck to trek through the jungle around the checkpoint. Toomer directs Perry to meet them at a grassy field on the far side. Perry doesn't know that this is the army's plan B. As he reaches the field, MPs fire at Perry, but again he escapes into the jungle. This time he's wounded. A bullet nicked his right foot. He packs it full of moss so it won't get infected, a trick he learned from the Naga. Perry limps through the jungle and hides in a rice paddy. Hours later, he awakes to the barking of German shepherds. The army's caught up to him. Perry escapes yet again. This time, the tip of his nose gets grazed by a bullet. He puts moss on this wound, too. Cullum receives a scolding note from his commanding officer for letting Perry get away. Cullum vows to capture Perry. February 22nd. A desperate Perry hides by the side of the Lido Road. His new plan is to board a truck, hide among the supplies, and hitch a ride over the mountains. When the truck reaches Burma, he'll ditch it and disappear into the jungle. But Perry is unwell. The gunshot on his foot is very painful. Also, he's had to drink river water and has caught dysentery. When Perry tries to hop on the back of a slow-moving truck, he's too weak and falls in the road, dropping yet another .45. The gun skids further away as it hits the ground. Perry realizes that a coolie has witnessed his failed hijack attempt. Spooked, he quickly melts back into the jungle. For the 3rd time, he leaves a gun behind. Cullum starts a mobile posse to hunt Perry. He begins visiting town after town to question locals. He also coordinates with the British and native police forces. He and his fellow posse follow Perry's trail for over 2 weeks. Cullum eventually figures out that Perry's headed in the direction of the town of Namrup. Perry's following the southeastern branch of the Tsang River. It's a long, indirect route to Tunga. However, Perry's probably taking this way because just south of Namrup is considered the gateway to the Naga heartland. Here, Perry would be able to make friends. Chances are some of the Naga tribes speak the same language as Perry's wife. Cullum realizes he has only a few days to catch up with Perry before he vanishes into a remote area again, maybe this time forever. Meanwhile, Perry's been growing weaker by the day from dysentery and malnutrition. He's surviving on stolen sugarcane and begging farmers for rice. Stupidly, Toomer and Troxler mention they're snitching on Perry to a colleague. The army has to evacuate them from Asia over threats of murder from Perry's fans. After a long, rough journey, the posse arrives in Namrup. Cullum receives a tip as to where Perry is. He's staying at a rural farm a few miles away. The posse waits until nightfall before hiking to the farm. Cautiously, the posse fans out and surrounds the farmer's basha. They find 3 Naga tribesmen wearing traditional dhotis sitting by a fire outside of the home. Cullum senses that there's something not quite right. He takes a closer look at the men. He then grabs one of them. It's Perry. He cut his afro and borrowed native clothing, hoping that he can pass for Naga by firelight. For the last time, Perry is taken into custody. Under tight security, a sickly Perry is transported to the Chabua stockade and kept in an isolation cell. The army decides not to return him to Lido stockade. They fear a potential racial uprising. Perry's interrogated by MPs who want to know where he got his guns. Perry refuses to snitch. He's sorry over Katie's death, but also says that he would have killed his pursuers if he had a chance. March 15, 1945. A few days after his capture, Perry is woken before dawn and under extremely tight security transported to Lido stockade. Per his last request, Perry is allowed to write a farewell letter to his brother Aaron and given a final cigarette before he's quietly hanged just after 7 a.m. March 17th. Perry's mother receives a notice from the army informing her of her son's death by judicial asphyxiation due to his own misconduct. Despite repeated requests for information, she hasn't heard anything since her lawyers submitted the brief in December. She knows nothing of her son's escapades or anti-hero status. Some months later, a small group of black GIs are on an expedition through the Patkai Mountains to check for survivors of a crashed cargo plane. They hire some Naga guides and end up spending the night at a remote village where one of the guides' relatives lives. As guests, the GI are served a special treat for dessert, canned fruit cocktail. One of the soldiers curiously inquires as to where the cocktail has come from. The next morning, before they leave, the soldiers are taken to the only basha in the village, painted a bright yellow-orange. It turns out to be owned by the chief's teenage daughter. Inside, the walls are decorated with wanted posters of Perry. You've seen the movie Castaway, and obviously now you're a bit of an expert on how to survive on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean. You first do some recon to see if anyone else is on the island and if there's anything to eat, like bananas conveniently dangling from trees, or any wandering animals. Nothing. It seems you'll have to fashion a spear so that you might do some shallow water fishing. Well, that turns out to be more difficult than you thought. At least you managed to collect some rainwater after a shower, using a large leaf as a receptacle. You're also well aware that if you don't find something head-shaped and proceed to draw eyes on it and a nose, you might lose your mind. You call him Rocky, or if it's a girl, you might call her Coco or Shelly. In reality, your chances of surviving on an uninhabited island for a long time are slim. If you got washed up without any tools, you might find yourself in a bit of a pickle. Even if you did find the most important thing, drinkable water, you're still gonna have to build a shelter, make a tool for hunting, and actually be able to hunt. Indeed, if there is anything available to kill. But some people have survived, and now we will introduce you to one Captain Thomas Musgrave, a man whose story is nothing short of amazing. He was born in England in 1832, but at the young age of 16 he set out to sail the seas for the first time. He made a career out of this, but when his ship, the Grafton, left Australia on the 12th of November 1863 to go out and search for mining and sealing opportunities, his life would change forever. A crew of just 5 first headed off to Campbell Island, which is part of New Zealand's sub-Antarctic islands. Quite frankly, it's in the middle of nowhere, but on that island it was believed that there would be tin to mine, and so off the guys went. They had a backup plan too, because if tin wasn't found, they could at least do a bit of seal hunting and on their return, sell the furs and oil. Sometimes life throws a curveball at you, and after reaching that remote place, the guys couldn't find any tin to mine. And on top of that, it seems the seals hadn't turned up for the hunting party. They couldn't go back empty-handed since explorations were an expensive endeavor. They decided to head back to Auckland Island and explore there. It was a Thursday, on December 31st, 1863. Not a good day for a sailor. Strong winds battered the ship. The water broke in all directions and a thick fog surrounded the vessel. These bad conditions remained, but on New Year's Day, the men got sight of the island. As they approached, they saw a large number of seals, so that lifted the men's moods. But then the bad weather again started to batter the ship. They managed to drop both anchors, but in the strong winds, heavy rain, and rough seas, they couldn't steady the ship. At around midnight, a violent gale blew the ship against the rocks. The water rushed into the ship, and in no time, the ocean was spilling onto the deck. The men abandoned all hope of pumping the water out and instead gathered up as many provisions as they could. The ship was wrecked. It was a lost cause. They did get close enough to the island to get their things and leave the ship, though. They were at least alive, but none of those 5 men could envision what awaited them. With them, they had some food. They had tools as well as a gun and gunpowder. For a shelter, they could use bits of the ship, including the sails. They got to work. A week passed and the men hadn't been able to get much done due to awful weather and vicious winds. But when things cleared up, they got to work on the shelter. With timber from the boat as well as cloth from the sails, it wasn't that hard to knock up a shelter. It helped that one of the crew members had experience in this, and he at least had a combination hammer, something similar to an axe and a drill. In time, they had a stable cabin to live in. Soon it would have a chimney so they could have a fire in the place, and that let the smoke out. It had a table, and to sleep on, the men made what looked like stretchers. Weeks passed and the provisions were running out, but those seals, they were virtually everywhere, and the men listened to them roar as they slept, which was like music to their ears. In fact, when they woke up, there'd be seals right outside their shelter, so the closest one got it and ended up seal meat. Living only on seal meat wasn't exactly the best diet, and the men didn't want to come down with scurvy, so they started looking for other food sources. Luckily, around the island there were widgeons, which are kinda like ducks. Those were very tasty. The guys also found that older seals tasted horrible, but if you could get a cub that had never even been in the water, it was delicious. On eating that for the first time, Musgrave remarked, "It tastes like lamb." The larger seals, it turned out, didn't much like those two-legged animals taking their cubs, and on occasion, they put up a fight. They were soon scared off when the men fired a gun. It wasn't always seal for dinner, though. The guys also ate a lot of fish and crabs. As deserted islands go, this wasn't the worst of places at times. Nonetheless, as the months passed, the men started wondering how long it would take for an expedition to find them, if anyone was looking for them at all. The fact was, those guys had long been thought of as dead. Only 2 months had passed when Musgrave wrote this in his diary. "I am in exceedingly low spirits today, and I know that one loved one in Sydney is so also. For I have no doubt but by this time they have given me up for lost, and what is to become of my own dear wife and children? May God, to whom they can now look for comfort, watch over and protect them, is my constant and fervent prayer. I shall never forgive myself for coming on this enterprise." What could they do to pass the time? Well, they worked on that house of theirs, and with all the timber they needed, they made a pretty decent abode. It kept out the cold, had an area for working, a kitchen area, and a warm fire. On top of that, they'd managed to keep the mosquitoes out, and that had been an annoyance. Some seal clubbing days, things didn't always go to plan. In fact, on one particular day, a tiger seal had taken offense to the clubbing of one of his young friends, and one of the men had to hide up a tree until the others came to his rescue. What Musgrave would call pitched battles with seals would become quite a regular occurrence. After months passed, the major battle was misery. The days were long, and the weather was terrible, and the men lost all hope of ever leaving the island. They played games and they made up their own dominoes, but there was only so much they could do to keep their spirits up. Their spirits were lifted considerably when one of the men made a huge breakthrough. What was that, you might ask? The answer is the man had successfully made his own hooch, a kind of prison beer that didn't taste too bad. He made this from a flower that grew all over the island, which he then fermented. They now had beer on tap for as long as they wanted, and it also became another part of their mixed diet. After a few months and a lot of drinks, they also had taught the parrots they had to talk, which was some amusement for them. Still, on May 15th, Musgrave wrote, "Oh my God, how long is this to last? Oh, release me from this bondage. Night and morning, day and in my dreams, I offer up my prayers to thee." They had better fishing techniques, but then in June the seals disappeared and their main food source was gone. The water was warmer and the seals spent most of their time in the water. Hunting them became difficult. Now came the hunger. Months passed and the seals finally returned. The men had food, but no hope of ever seeing a ship sail close to the island. In October, Musgrave wrote, "It would be impossible for me to convey to anyone an idea of my present state of mind. I am anything but mad. If that would come, it would very likely afford relief." It was that month that the men realized that they had to get off the island. Food wasn't always available, and there were periods of terrible hunger. Their health was affected, but some had been injured while out hunting and surveying. Things weren't looking good. Building a ship to sail through rough waters isn't quite as easy as the movies depict, and without an expert or even a carpenter, Musgrave wrote that the idea of just making a ship that wouldn't sink in a second seemed farcical to him. Nonetheless, the men collected as many parts of the wreckage as they could and discussed how they'd build this thing. If anything, they had time in the day to think and build. Besides bouts of hunger, the men managed to start putting something together that looked seaworthy. Musgrave wrote, "I hope we may succeed. It's quite true that by energetic perseverance, men may perform wonders, and our success would by no means constitute a miracle. The men are all very sanguine, and I have no doubt but we shall be able to make something that will carry us to New Zealand." Sanguine means positive, if you didn't know that. Over a year had passed, and there had been failed attempts to launch their homemade boat. Some days were spent fixing that thing, and others were spent in hunger and looking for grubs to eat. Musgrave put his diary down for months, and then in spring he picked it back up again. The men are in what he calls a deplorable state, skinny and dressed in rags. They face grim starvation at times and almost want to gnaw on their own hands. In June, Musgrave wrote, "We were all seized with a violent attack of dysentery about the same time. This we have all recovered from, but I am left with rheumatic pains and cramps, which will in all probability cling to me through life." But it's time to launch the boat. Even though they accept there is little probability of success, they will not survive much longer on the island, but the thought of drowning also weighs heavily on their minds. One thing that did lift their spirits was the discovery of a cat, which stayed with them while they finished their vessel. On the 27th of June, they launched the boat, which was so frightening some of the men wanted to return to the island. After attempts to sail were made, it was clear that 5 men were just too heavy, and it was decided that 2 men would be left behind, and if the others made it home, they would send out a ship to collect them. The 3 finally managed to sail to Stewart Island, which was inhabited. There, they met a Captain Cross, the first human they'd seen in 18 months. This is what Musgrave wrote. "When we landed, I could not stand, but was led up to that gentleman's house, where something to eat was immediately prepared for us, of which I partook very sparingly, for I felt ill and unable to eat." Weeks passed, but the men and Captain Cross eventually made it back to the island, where they hoped the 2 men that were left behind were still alive. This is how Musgrave described the joyous meeting. "One of them, the cook, on seeing me, turned as pale as a ghost and staggered up to a post, against which he leaned for support, for he was evidently on the point of fainting, while the other, George, seized my hand in both of his and gave my arm a severe shaking, crying, 'Captain Musgrave, how are ye, how are ye?' What's more incredible is that 4 months after those men had been shipwrecked on that island, another ship had been destroyed and another group of sailors were trying to survive on another part of the island. Both groups had no idea the other was on the island. On that other ship, only 19 of the 25 men got to shore and the others drowned. They didn't have the same luck and there was less to eat, and in the end only 3 survived when they were seen by a passing ship. Some died of starvation, others were abandoned. In their case, it was every man for himself rather than the collaboration Musgrave enjoyed with his men. One of the 3 survivors said things were grim, and at one point 2 men got in a fight and one killed the other. The next morning, the winner of that fight was eating the loser. Imagine sitting in a prison cell and contemplating life, and how it will be all over quite soon. You're going to be executed by way of hanging, and no doubt you're wondering how that will go. You hope it'll be quick. It's not so much oblivion that scares you, but the fact that hanging might not go exactly as it should, and you'll spend some seconds or even minutes in agonizing pain. It wouldn't be the first time a man has been left dangling with life still in him. One thing you're not considering at all is the possibility of surviving your execution. Never mind surviving 3 attempts to execute you. Welcome to the life of John Lee, the criminal they just couldn't kill. Before we get to the momentous moment in history that tainted the image of the British authorities, and before we investigate the theories as to why the job at hand failed, you need to know a bit about hanging in the first place. That way you might better understand how John Lee escaped with his life intact. Prior to the British getting a bit more humane about this method of execution, it was quite brutal, albeit likely a better way to go than past forms of execution such as being burned or boiled or torn apart at the limbs. Hanging in the old days might have involved climbing onto something and then having your neck put inside a noose. Then the object is taken from under the person and they die from strangulation. In the 19th century, scientists aired their views and said dislocating the neck was a more humane way to kill someone than strangulation on a rope. In 1866, the idea was proposed to drop the person from a certain height to ensure this quick snap and ensuing death. This method was called a standard drop.
At the time, a scientist named Samuel Houghton said the height of the drop to secure a fast death should be between 4 and 6 feet. That way, there would be no dangling and terrible discomfort.
The standard drop was soon seen as backwards due to the fact that it didn't take into account a person's height and weight. In 1872, a new method was introduced that was called the long drop. The person was connected to a noose and stood on a scaffold which had a trap door. When the door was opened, down fell the body. The authorities had to calculate the proportions of the person's body so that the neck would snap and kill the person quickly, but not drop the person so much that he or she would be decapitated. This can and has happened, and while death is death, losing the head was not something anyone wanted to see. So that's where we were around the time of Mr. John Lee is going to go to the scaffold. On November 15, 1884, he murdered a woman named Emma Ann Whitehead Keyes. This happened in a small village called Babbacombe, which is in Devon in the south of England. Lee was arrested, but always protested that he was innocent of the crime. But there was some evidence to the contrary, including a knife wound that he had incurred during the murder. The woman had been killed with a knife. Prior to her downfall, Keyes had lived alone with her servants and cooks, and Lee had once worked there too. He left that job, joined the Navy, returned to Devon, and was arrested for stealing. After his release from prison, he returned to the manor and worked for Keyes again. It was perhaps a bad move on her part to take him back in. When she was found dead, there had only been one person in the house at the time, and that was Lee. Then there was the cut on his arm, which pointed at his guilt. Besides that, there wasn't really anything else the police had on him, and in 1884, there was no CSI Devon. Maybe it wasn't him who had committed the murder, and he certainly thought he'd been falsely convicted. He once said, "The reason I'm so calm is that I trust in the Lord, and He knows I'm innocent." He was sentenced to be hanged at Exeter Prison on the 23rd of February, 1884. On the day of the event, the executioner, named James Barry, went through the checks. Scaffold, all good. Noose, correctly tied. Trap door, working fine. What could possibly go wrong? All we know is that Lee was taken to the scaffold and his head was fastened to the noose. A white hood was put over his head, and when the signal was given, the trap door didn't open. They tried again, and then again. And you can only imagine what was going through Lee's mind after each time he gritted his teeth and prepared for the great unknown. This was a total embarrassment for anyone involved, and the medical officer said enough is enough. He said he can't hang around any longer after those failures. Lee was unfastened from the noose the last time and was taken back to prison. But what actually went wrong since the entire apparatus had been tested? Well, the executioner wrote about the experience as well as some other 130-plus executions in a book called My Experiences as an Executioner. He admitted in that book that the science didn't always work, and some men died too slowly or lost their heads. But Lee's case was extraordinary. These are two excerpts from that book. 1. On the Saturday, I examined this drop and reported it was much too frail for its purpose, but I worked the lever and found that the doors dropped all right. 2. The noise of the bolt sliding could be plainly heard, but the doors did not fall. I stamped on the drop to shake it loose, and so did some of the warders, but none of our efforts could stir it. Lee stood like a statue, making no sound or sign. Between each attempt, they actually took Lee away. He had the hood removed from his head and was taken to a room. The authorities then tried the trapdoor mechanism again, and it worked fine. Lee was brought back out, fastened in the noose, hood put over his head, and they tried it again. It didn't work, 3 times in all. By golly, thought the authorities, the entire experience was frighteningly perturbing and just a little bit disturbing. Executioner Barry wrote that some people believed there was a possibility of the trapdoor being swollen by the rain, but he added that they even cut the door with an axe and a plane, and it still didn't work when it needed to. In the end, he concluded that it was the iron catches that had somehow stuck when Lee's weight was on the trapdoor. It was one of the low points of his career. The British Home Secretary, Sir William Harcourt, commuted Lee's sentence, saying it would shock the feeling of anyone if a man had twice to pay the pangs of imminent death. Lee ended up serving 22 years behind bars. The thing is, investigations years later show that Lee might not have been the only person in the house that night, and he might have been wrongly convicted. Maybe there really was some divine intervention on his part. What's also a mystery is what happened to Lee after he was released. No one really knows, since he just kind of disappeared. Some rumors suggest he kept his head down and he moved to London, while others say he moved abroad. More recent research suggests that he went over the pond and that his grave is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That research asserts that he had abandoned his wife and 2 kids in England and started a new life in the States. It's possible he was buried there in 1945. In one of the most remote and unforgiving wildernesses in the world, 2 strangers sit huddled in a makeshift tent they've built. The man and the young woman are freezing and on the verge of death. A snowstorm batters their makeshift tent. The wind blasts seem to the pair like nature itself has a vendetta against them. They're miles away from any town, and what they don't know is that as they sit and wait, the media is saying there is little hope the missing pair will be found alive. The storm abates, and suddenly the woman sees a plane in the sky, but her hope is crushed as it fades into the distance. "In the name of God," she says, "please come back." She's well aware she doesn't have long to live. The story starts at the beginning of the 1960s, a decade that would become renowned for its decadence and colorful youth culture. Just prior to that decade, there was the Beat movement, a counterculture that enshrined something that would become known as the road trip, with Jack Kerouac's book On the Road inspiring many young Americans to take off and explore their own country from end to end. And that's just what a young Jewish girl from New York named Helen Klaben wanted to do, to follow in the footsteps of people who turned away from convention and instead went looking for adventure. When Klaben was just 20 years old, she saw an ad in a newspaper asking if anyone wanted to share the gas costs and take a car all the way to Fairbanks, Alaska. She replied, and the two set off on a long journey. After a few months in Alaska, she knew where she wanted to explore next, and that was the mystical East. She wasn't sure where she'd go exactly, maybe India, maybe Hong Kong, but before that she had to get to a destination to take a flight across the world. That destination was San Francisco, a city on the verge of a cultural revolution. Early in 1963, Klaben met a 41-year-old Mexican-American amateur pilot by the name of Ralph Flores. He was an aircraft mechanic that hailed from California, and he too wanted to get back home and leave Alaska. The pair agreed to share the expenses of the journey, and off they went to their first destination, which was the capital of the Yukon Territory, Whitehorse, the most populated place in that wild part of the world. They had another stop after that, and that was at Fort St. John in British Columbia. It was winter and bitterly cold. Snowstorms raged and the plane was grounded for 3 days. A small single-engine airplane couldn't hope to fly over such an unforgiving territory in such bad conditions. Nonetheless, with the weather warning still present, the two took off again into the sky. Their next landing would be anything but smooth. The pair flew for hours in strong winds, the plane being tossed around like a dandelion seed in a strong breeze. Flores could hardly see anything with the snow blasting against the plane. He and Klaben knew they somehow had to get out of that storm, so Flores attempted to get above the clouds and out of danger. His plan was to come back down and find the Alaska Highway, which would lead him to the airport. That was the thing. He needed the road to get his bearings because, being an amateur, he didn't quite understand the instruments in the aircraft. On top of that, he hadn't even packed emergency supplies on board in case of a crash. There were no real tools, not much in terms of food supplies, nothing to keep someone warm, and not even a gun in case they came up against a rather hungry animal. The Yukon is full of bears, small ones, large ones, and utterly fearsome ones. They at least had a knife. It was a time of desperation, and Klaben started to lose her cool. She knew that the pilot was totally lost, but he refused to admit that. Then she suddenly saw a mountainside and some trees, and she knew they were going to crash. She said to herself, "Okay, Helen, here it comes." And it came with a bang. She closed her eyes and just hoped for the best, and when she opened them, she was alive. The plane had landed at the side of a mountain close to the Yukon-British Columbia border. She had a broken arm, and she had some broken ribs and a fractured jaw. There was nothing but mountains and trees around, and snow covered everything. Just walking around was an effort because the temperature at times would go down to negative 45 degrees Celsius. They huddled in the wreckage of the plane to escape the blistering cold. Frostbite was a certainty in these conditions if they stayed out too long in the open. As days went by, search parties flew over the skies and looked for the pair, but it was incredibly difficult to see anything in between the trees when everything is covered with snow. They literally had nothing to eat after they finished off some cans of sardines, tuna, fruit, and some crackers. There were no supplies at all after that, and they were only 10 days in. The one important thing they could do to survive was to melt snow for water. They had a box of matches and so could make a fire. With both of them in pain from their injuries and without the equipment to hunt, they just sat and waited and starved. Day by day, the pounds came off as their bodies burned their own fat reserves. Flores did try and make something that looked like a slingshot, but it was useless, and he soon gave up on hunting rabbits. They did have another thing though, and in a way you might call that an emergency supply for the religious mind. It was a Bible, something Flores took everywhere with him since he'd converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a devout Mormon. He told Klaben that this crash they'd experienced had some significance in regard to the bigger picture of things. He told her to read the Bible and they would be saved. She had to convert. Each day, they heard planes rumbling overhead, and each day Klaben continued reading the Bible, hoping her devout accomplice was right about his God. He actually told her that if she read the whole thing and then accepted the divinity of Jesus Christ, they would be saved. She wasn't exactly comforted by this and didn't believe him, but hey, there wasn't that much reading material in the middle of nowhere. Weeks now passed and they made a discovery. They found toothpaste, and that suddenly started looking tasty. Each day they squeezed the tube and gratefully swallowed the minty cream. They knew it wasn't really sustenance, but it was at least something to put in their mouths. They also had chewing gum, and they chewed that for weeks on end. Things got desperate after a few weeks, and while they could at least keep themselves a little bit warm with insulation they made out of clothes and cushions, Klaven got serious frostbite and then gangrene in her foot. She could now hardly move at all. She was all but ready to give up the ghost and had lost about a third of her body weight. Flores just told her to keep reading that Bible and never give up hope of a rescue. Still, as time went by, even he seemed to have given up on one of those planes in the sky seeing them. Flores then told Klaven that since he could walk, he would go and try to find civilization. He walked off in the woods, leaving her behind to her own thoughts. She decided to write about what happened, but soon gave up on that when it started to sound like an epitaph. She wasn't ready to sign off just yet. 8 days later, and Flores came back. He told his dying companion that he had at least found what looked like a clearing, and so humans might have been there. There was also much more chance of someone seeing them from the sky once they were away from all the trees. They had to walk there and make a shack of some sort. It took hours to get there. Klaven's foot was badly infected now, and the pain of walking was unbearable. As they got closer to the clearing, they heard a noise, like a humming, in the distance. Flores went in search of that noise and then returned sometime later. He told Klaven he'd found a frozen pond and that he'd written SOS in it, and also etched the shape of an arrow that pointed to where they were. He'd done this with the snowshoes he'd made out of tree bark. He told Klaven he'd go out again with a mirror and try to catch sight of the pilot. She didn't want to be alone again, but he assured her that it was the only option now. Was there hope? It was day 47 of their ordeal, a day after Klaven had finished reading the Bible. And now we introduce you to a man of the wild, one Charles Chuck Hamilton. In March that year, as those two were freezing and starving to death, he was out in his plane trying to spot animals to hunt. He had a good eye for that kind of thing. He spotted no moose that day, but he did see SOS written into what looked like a frozen pond. He didn't immediately think about the missing plane. That had been weeks ago, and it wasn't something that was still on his mind. In fact, he and his passenger thought that the remark must have been left by a trapper, seeing as trappers did sometimes find themselves in difficulty in the wild. At the same time, Klaven had seen the plane in the sky. She made a fire and frantically threw green pine on it. Black smoke gushed into the sky. Surely, someone would see that. She was now in tears, full of desperate joy, ignoring the pain in her foot. Flores was out in the woods trying to use the mirror to flash sunlight back at the plane. Hamilton actually had to turn away from the black smoke since it was so thick and heavy, but it was then he saw a man standing with a mirror in his hands. Hamilton found a place to set down the plane near a cabin on an airport lake. He was about 6 miles away from the pair. Trappers were working at this cabin, and that's the noise the pair had heard. The trappers had been cutting firewood with the chainsaw. All these men got together with their dogs and set off to find the man with the mirror. Because of the smoke, Klaven hadn't yet been seen. Hamilton then left the trappers and said he'd investigate from the sky again. But now that fire had died down. When he looked at where the fire had been, he could just make out a tent. He then made a radio call and said, "I think I found the lost people." Night was now falling, and so Hamilton returned home, hoping the trappers had found those people. The media called him all night long, but he couldn't sleep anyway, thinking about the poor souls alone out there. At this point, no one knew if there was just one survivor or two, since only the man with the mirror had been seen. Hamilton only guessed the woman was the source of the fire. The trappers actually did find Flores that night, but Klaven waited the whole night alone at the shelter. It was now pitch black, and the rescue would have to wait until morning. Hamilton actually turned to his wife and said, "What if she's dead when I get there?" He flew off before dawn and landed a couple miles from where that tent was. From there, he walked in, and about 1 hour later, Klaven saw a hulk of a man striding toward her. A man she said was pixie-faced. When he met her, she embraced him and cried and kissed his grizzled cheek. The brave woman said she could walk out even with a terribly infected, frostbitten foot. Hamilton responded to that, saying, "If I can carry a moose out of the woods, I can carry you." It took some time, though, walking on snowshoes with a woman on his back. A frail woman, at least, who now only weighed 100 pounds. When Klaven was finally taken to a hospital, the doctor said she wouldn't have lasted one more night. Had they stayed another night, that SOS in the lake would have been covered. They were discovered in the nick of time. When Klaven was well enough, she met with a host of reporters, to whom she acclaimed, "Hey, I'm alive!" She was all good except a few missing toes. Klaban soon went back to Brooklyn and Flores went home to his family in California. She never did convert and become a Mormon, but she later said the ordeal did make her more spiritual. The experience, she said, helped her to find herself. In an interview, she said most people expect they'd not be able to cope with the crisis, and it was a great experience to find out that I could. Klaban wrote a book about what had happened and never lost her sense of adventure, traveling through many regions of Asia and Europe and the Americas. She died in 2018, aged 76. Flores was also 76 when he passed away in 1997. So we guess these two had one last experience they could share. The now old Chuck Hamilton left the wilds and moved to Victoria, where he lives today with his family. He keeps a token of the event in his basement, a bit of the wreckage with the serial number N5886. As a policeman in 1925 Paris, you've seen a lot. The country is still recovering from the Great War, and society is in chaos. The great city takes pride in its iconic landmark, the Eiffel Tower, but there have been reports that it's falling into disrepair. Still, you never expected to read a report like this. A con man is attempting to sell the Eiffel Tower to scrap metal dealers. And what's more, it might not have been the first time. You can't imagine the nerve of someone to try to pull off a scam like this, so brazen and on such a large scale. Who could be confident enough to try to get away with this? One thing's for sure, you're going to get to the bottom of this case, and you want to start at the beginning of this con man's dossier. The perp's name is Victor Lustig, and he's been leaving a trail of cons and fraud across both sides of the Atlantic. Born in Holstein, Austria-Hungary in 1890, it was clear from an early age that he was a brilliant boy. He excelled in his studies, but he also had a tendency to skirt the rules and look for trouble. By the time he was 19, he was studying in Paris and found himself falling into the company of fellow gamblers. He was successful at the tables, but his passion for women led him into more trouble. An encounter with the jealous boyfriend of one of his paramours left him with a distinctive scar on the left side of his face. He left school not long after and soon parlayed his studies and his multilingual skills into the one thing he had always been best at: scamming people. As soon as Lustig began his new career, he started weaving a fiction about his life. He told everyone he met that he'd been raised by his Bürgermeister, or mayor, of his small Austrian town. In fact, his mother and father were poor peasants who lived in a modest house made of stone. He liked to say that he would only steal from the greedy and dishonest, but in reality, Lustig was only looking for the marks with the deepest pockets. That led him to a fertile location to begin his criminal career: the transatlantic ocean liners that made voyages between France and New York City. These luxurious ships were filled with rich travelers enjoying all the amenities of first class, several high-quality meals a day, comfortable sleeping quarters, and parties that made the perfect opportunity to size up potential marks. Lustig was an excellent talker, and his signature move was presenting himself as a learned, wealthy man seeking investment in a project in New York. One of his favorite tricks was pretending to be a musical producer seeking investment in a Broadway musical. Art-loving rich travelers were quick to invest for a share in the show, but they would never see any of that money back. The show never existed, and Lustig would be on to his next scam before they realized what would happen. But Lustig's Great Ocean Con hit a snafu when World War I made the Atlantic a much more dangerous place, and leisure travel was suspended, so he decided it was time to make his name on dry land in the United States. There was only one problem for Lustig: law enforcement was much more active on the mainland, and he soon became one of the most wanted men in America. He pulled one scam after another, including a 1922 caper where he pulled off an elaborate heist on a bank. He entered the bank offering them bonds tied to a repossessed property in exchange for cash on hand. But Lustig had studied sleight of hand artists, and he was just as good at hands-on con jobs as he was at talking his way into money. He managed to trick the teller into handing over the cash and escaped with both the cash and the bonds in hand. But defrauding a bank is a federal law enforcement affair, and soon Lustig had powerful investigators on his tail. Lustig was always trying to stay one step ahead of the law, and so he needed a scam that let him get money in a hurry and then be on his way before he was caught. That's how he developed his most common scheme: the Romanian box. Haven't you ever wished you could just make money appear out of thin air? It would certainly solve some of your cash problems. Lustig preyed on this desire and presented his marks with a large mahogany box with 2 small slots. He claimed it took 6 hours to create an identical duplicate. He would ask for a denomination, place it in the device, and then wait with them while the device supposedly worked. He would even take them to a bank to authenticate the supposed duplicate. But he was using sleight of hand to swap out the real and fake bills. He would then sell the box at a high rate. leaving them to figure out it was a hoax once he was long gone. But eventually, Lustig's tricks started catching up with him, and he had too many law enforcement agents on his tail. It was 1925, and Lustig decided to return to France until the heat died down. That led him to the biggest opportunity of his career. The Eiffel Tower may have been one of Paris's proudest landmarks, but the post-war era had led to hard times. The monument was starting to rust, and maintenance and repainting the thing was taking a financial toll. When Lustig read an article that said the public might eventually support it being torn down, Lustig hatched his wildest plan yet, one that would make him the most wanted man in France. Lustig often referred to himself as a count, part of his obsession with attaining the high-class status that had evaded him in youth. That gave him access to some of the richest and most powerful people on both sides of the Atlantic, and he had developed a 10 commandments of the con that would let him pull off one of the most ambitious scams in history. Be a patient listener, never look bored, wait for the other person to reveal their politics, then agree with them. Let the other person reveal their religious views, then agree with them. Be open to discussing sex, but only follow it up if the mark displays strong interest. Don't discuss illness unless the mark shows concern. Don't pry into a person's personal circumstances, wait for them to reveal them to you. Never boast, just let your importance become obvious. Never be untidy. And finally, never get drunk to keep your wits about you. Lustig applied these rules at all times, but never more so than when he began his Eiffel Tower scam. He hired a forger to produce fake government stationery that let him present himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Contacting some of Paris's most powerful scrap metal dealers, he told them that the government had decided that the Eiffel Tower was a money loser and needed to be dismantled and sold for scrap. Warning them that this was a big secret that would cause public uproar if revealed, he told them he was in charge of picking the dealer who would get the job. Many of the dealers were taken in, agreeing that the modernist Eiffel Tower didn't fit in with the city's other classic monuments like the famous Gothic cathedrals. Lustig wasn't looking to deal with more than one dealer, he was looking for the perfect mark. And he found it in André Poisson, an underdog desperate to gain acceptance in the higher levels of Paris's business community. Lustig pretended to accept his bid and pretended to be a corrupt official seeking a bribe of $70,000 to guarantee Poisson's place as the winning scrap detail. Poisson paid Lustig off, and Lustig soon ran off to Austria with the money. Lustig had picked his target well, because Poisson was so embarrassed by his failure that he never reported the theft to the police, and Lustig's massive scam was undetected. It's a wild story of a con man with a fearless confidence in his own ability to scam people. But Lustig had one weakness: he was overconfident, and he dared to pull the same scam for a second time. On your desk, you've got the report of Lustig's second attempt to sell the Eiffel Tower. Only months after fleeing to Austria, Lustig contacted a second group of scrap dealers and found another mark in them. He played everything exactly the same way, down to the bribe. But his second mark wasn't quite as weak-willed as Poisson. He reported Lustig to the police, and you have your best shot at getting this notorious con man behind bars. Alas, it isn't to be. In the post-war era, transatlantic travel is easy again, and Lustig is able to hop a liner to the US. But you can't get his brazen scams out of your mind, and you make sure to keep up on the exploits of this notorious con man across the pond. He doesn't disappoint as he returns to his old haunts, but the failed Eiffel Tower scam and close call might have unnerved him because it seems like he's becoming more reckless and more arrogant in his targets. Lustig's later exploits in the US continue his most common tricks, but they also pick riskier targets and require more close calls. That brings down more law enforcement attention on him. In 1928, Lustig was invited to the Massachusetts home of a businessman, Thomas Kearns, to discuss an investment. While there, he pulled off a hands-on theft of $16,000 from Kearns' home. Sure enough, Kearns called the police and Lustig was on the run again. But that was nothing compared to the dangerous targets he went after next. He pulled a con on the notorious gangster Al Capone, attempting to get Capone to invest in a mutual scam. He never intended to actually scam Capone because he had no intention of sleeping with the fishes. Instead, he borrowed money for an investment, then returned it claiming the con had fallen through. He then convinced his business partner Capone to give him $5,000 to help him get out of town. Incredibly, it worked, but Lustig had played with fire for very little reward. By 1930, Lustig had partnered with a pair of counterfeiters, William Watts and Tom Shaw. Their goal was to mass-produce fake money and sell it. But Lustig's lust for risky cons continued to escalate as he attempted to scam a Texas sheriff. He sold the sheriff one of his Romanian boxes, but when the sheriff realized he had been scammed, he pursued Lustig all the way to New York. Incredibly, once caught, Lustig actually convinced the sheriff he'd just been using the box wrong and gave him a compensation of several $1,000s, which were all counterfeit, of course. When the sheriff tried to use the money, he was arrested for passing counterfeit money. This became another entry in Lustig's growing dossier of crimes as he was pursued by federal and local officials across America. So, what was Lustig's undoing? Not one of his scams, but a con of the heart. Lustig was known for being a ladies' man, and he had his own mistress, Billy May, while also pursuing his business partner's younger lover. When Billy May found out, she called the authorities and left an anonymous tip. Lustig was soon arrested in New York for counterfeiting and quickly threw his business partners under the bus. But when the key in his possession was proven to open a locker full of counterfeit bills, Lustig was caught red-handed. The law had finally won over the notorious Count. But Lustig had one last trick up his sleeve. The day before his trial began, Lustig pretended to be sick. That gave him the opportunity to use a rope he made to escape from a medical wing. He was on the run for almost a month before being captured in Pittsburgh. This time, there was no escape, and he pled guilty at his trial. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison plus 5 for the escape. He was sent to the notorious Alcatraz Island in California, where he was easily the sharpest-dressed inmate taken into the prison. But there was one enemy Victor Lustig couldn't out-talk, out-scam, or con. After serving 12 years of his sentence, Lustig came down with a bad case of pneumonia and died 2 years later. The Eiffel Tower, however, is still standing strong and has been repaired, repainted, and is secure as one of France's most beloved landmarks. And that's case closed on one of the most notorious con men ever to plague 2 continents. And now go check out mystery figure pulls scam on entire town with insane prank. Or for how scams have evolved since Victor's master plan, try worst online scams. Thanks for watching and see you next time.